Great. All right, so good morning, good afternoon, good day to everyone. We are at the PodRecs Workshop on Podcast Recommendations at RecSys 2021. It's very good to see you all here. I want to do a quick introduction of my co-organizers. I'm Ching-Wei Chen from Spotify, and we have with us today Rosie Jones and Zara Nazari, also from Spotify. Long Chi Yang will be joining us a little later. He's on the West Coast, but he's from Microsoft. Maria Escovich from Clarin Eric, Gareth Jones from Dublin City University, and Sergio Oramas from Pandora SiriusXM. I also wanted to give a big thank you to our program committee from all over for helping us review the submissions for the workshop. And I'm very pleased to announce the accepted papers for this year. We have 3 papers that they will be presenting later today. And you'll hear more about them later, but congratulations to the accepted papers. A quick, in addition to the accepted papers, we'll also be hearing from Rosie. She'll be giving our keynote today on the topic of listening to our listeners, podcast content understanding for search and recommendations. We will also be featuring a podcast creator panel. We have this panel moderated by Nino from Spotify. And we're very lucky to have panelists who are prominent podcasters and producers of podcasts joining us to discuss their hopes, their dreams, and their fears about podcast recommendations. So we have today Wendy Zuckerman, who is a radio journalist and the creator and host of Science Versus. We have Patrick Cox, who is an editor, reporter, and the creator of the Subtitle podcast. We have Ali Bandari, who is the creator and host of Channel B and B Plus podcast, and also Josh Richmond, who's a producer of the Stitcher series of Earwolf podcasts. So that should be pretty exciting. A quick glance of the program for today. We'll start with a keynote. And then after the keynote, we have an interactive workshop activity. If anyone joined last year, we had a lot of fun in our breakout rooms, thinking about ways to kind of bootstrap a podcast recommender system. This year, Gareth will be leading these breakout rooms again with some tasks that are coming off of the keynote. We also then will go into, after a break, we'll go into the papers, the paper presentations, and have another break. And then we will have the podcast creator panel and then wrap up and finish. So we're going to start right now with the keynote. I'll hand it over to Rosie. Rosie is our director of the Language Technologies Lab at Spotify. And I'll hand it over to her.
Thank you. So today I'm going to talk about listening to our listeners, to our podcast listeners, podcast content understanding for search and recommendation. And I'm going to talk about some open challenges. It's quite common when we give a talk that we talk about the things we've done and really focus on the accomplishments and how much we know. Today, I'm also going to bring up some issues of things we don't know yet to help us think through in this workshop how we might develop our research on podcast recommendation further. So first of all, I'd like to say I'm very happy to be here in Amsterdam with you all. It's so exciting to come to Amsterdam, ride a bicycle, see some people, and it's great to get out. But the truth is, actually, I'm still at home in Boston, in my bedroom. Boston is a place that if you've been to the USA, you might know. It's quite famous for the baseball. Its historic buildings are not quite as historic as those in Amsterdam, and I'm quite fond of the ocean in Boston.
Rosie, we don't see your presentation.
Oh boy, after all that. Did I share my screen? I didn't hit share. I didn't hit share. I thought I'd be brave and not say, can you see my screen? Okay. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
There's our baseball field. Here's our buildings not as historic as those in Amsterdam. Here's the ocean at Situate, Massachusetts. It's really nice. So when I'm dreaming of going to Amsterdam, one of the ways I can kind of get a little bit closer is by listening to podcasts about it, Amsterdam and the Netherlands. So when I look for some podcasts about Amsterdam, these are some things that come up. And there's a lot of interesting things here. There's language learning podcasts. There is history of the Netherlands. There's travel to Amsterdam, which seems like it could be really interesting. And so then, you know, I got to kind of pick out one of these that I might want to listen to. There's lots of different reasons that people listen to podcasts. Really top one of the motivations people have is to learn things and explore more for their hobbies and interests, to learn practical knowledge. And so it's a really wide range of reasons to listen to things. So people do things like follow the host, I guess, or even for emotional companionship. As far as how popular podcasts are, they're really growing in popularity. Internationally being listened to by lots and lots of people. These numbers are now a little bit out of date, they're 2019, but we're just seeing the interest in podcasts is growing more and more. And one of the reasons that podcasts are popular is because you do listen to them while multitasking. And so this survey showed that a lot of people listen to podcasts while riding public transportation, while doing housework, while doing other things. And if you look at how often people are listening to a podcast, well, sorry, and just this data was from China, so people riding public transportation are probably taking trains. If in the US, people are listening to podcasts while driving. And I suspect if we're in Amsterdam, we might see people listening to podcasts while riding their bicycles. But as far as when people listen to podcasts, really they're often doing something. And in fact, as far as not only 3% of the time are people listening to podcasts while they're not doing anything else, and quite a large fraction of the time people listen to podcasts is to relax before going to sleep. And I certainly find that that is a motivation for me. On the other hand, I can't always listen to the podcast all the way through if it's a very relaxing one. And so we have a few data sets around for studying podcasts. This one I'm indicating here is from Spotify. We released a data set of about 100,000 podcasts last year for research on search and summarization. And I'll talk a little bit about this and how we think about podcast recommendation. So this data set, sorry, it's going faster than expected, has about 100,000 podcasts. Each podcast has metadata, such as the name, the description, the publisher, has a raw audio file, and it also has a machine-generated transcript, so a transcript of what was said generated by automatic speech recognition. And this adds up to about 60,000 hours of audio, or 2 terabytes of data, and 600 million words of transcript. So it's a really large data set. On the other hand, and normally I'd be saying what a great data set this is. It's a really great opportunity to be doing research on NLP problems on podcasts. All your favorite NLP problems are applicable here, on speech document retrieval, spoken document retrieval problems. But on the other hand, this doesn't have any user ratings or behavior data. So when we come to RecSys and want to talk about recommendation, this data set doesn't give you everything you need to start some experiments for recommendation. There's lots of different kinds of podcasts in there, and I'll talk a little bit more about that, lots of the styles that we see in podcasts. But just to sort of briefly digress to another data set, Long Chi Yang and colleagues made another data set that consists of 88,000 episodes. That does have some ratings. It has binary popularity labels for 6,500 episodes. So it's a modest annotated set size. It has transcripts of the first 10 minutes of audio, and then some of the annotations they asked were things like, how calm or energetic is this? They asked for Amazon Mechanical Turkers, how humorous or serious is the audio presentation? And then also they got, as I mentioned, the binary popularity labels. And so Yang et al. Were able to carry out some experiments, and this, on the other hand, was binary task, popular or less popular, which doesn't give us detailed user listening behavior to help us build models to predict how we would recommend podcasts to an individual user. So things we might want from a podcast recommendation data set, we could consider existing recommendation sets like the Netflix Prize dataset, the Movie Lens data. These tend to have user judgments on many items. Ideally, we'd have user interactions. And also Francesco Beghetto later today is going to talk about some other things that he sees as things that we would want to think about when designing a podcast recommendation data set. So one open research problem in podcast recommendation is explanation. So why did I get that list of podcasts recommended to me? So this one here is a sleep podcast. That might be a good one for me if I'd like to listen to podcasts while going to sleep. It's about rain in Amsterdam, so I might not learn so much about the topic of Amsterdam, but on the other hand, I might have a relaxing experience. And another one that's recommended to me here is Idiots and Abroad. And if we look closer at this one, it's 128 minutes long. So that's a big, big time investment if I'm going to be listening to this one, not for going to sleep, but for some more contentful or learning exercise. So it'd be really nice to know more about what's in this podcast, what it's about, when I'm going to decide to make a commitment like that. And so we might ask, is that uncharacteristic that this podcast is so long? We can kind of take a look at the distribution of podcast lengths and see what kind of time commitment it is for people. In fact, this is a distribution of lengths of podcasts. So this is the duration in minutes. And this is the number of podcasts of that length in this data set of 100,000 podcasts. And we find, on the one hand, there are a lot of 2-minute long podcasts. That turns out to be podcasts that are specialized in length for listening to while you're brushing your teeth. And I admit it could be nice to have some little 2-minute vignettes about Amsterdam while brushing my teeth before the conference this morning. There are other ones that, and quite common, is this bump around 30 minutes. And there we see sort of the really professionally produced podcasts where the creator has recorded perhaps a longer piece of audio and then edited down just to the most interesting pieces. And so that's actually kind of an interesting place in length of podcasts. But then we see longer, very chatty podcasts, and even way out on the tail here, we've got very, very long podcasts like my dog's favorite podcast, something you play to keep your dog company while you're, say, out at work, to give them some comforting noises. And then this one we were just talking about, Joms in Amsterdam, is out here in the 2 hours and 8-minute length. So it's going to be a really big commitment to listen to a podcast like that. So it'd be nice to have, if having this podcast recommended to me, a explanation to give me some information about what's in this podcast that might appeal to me from a topical point of view, or other things that might be relevant to me when I'm considering whether to listen to this one. So if we look a little bit closer at this, it comes with a description. So we know the duration, it comes with a description, and the description is, welcome to episode 2 of Idiots and Abroad. John left Korea, made it to Amsterdam. Alana left Australia. Jacob visited Vegas, and Rahul is still in Los Angeles. Compelling. So they say it's compelling. I'd like to know if it'd be compelling for me, and how much of it is really about Amsterdam, or is that really just a very passing topic? Would also be a kind of thing I'd want to know when I'm making this decision about whether to listen to this podcast. And actually, if we look more generally at what people say is important to them when they're considering listening to a new podcast show, they mention the podcast description a lot. That's the most common thing that's recommended. Then they mention the titles of episodes in that podcast show, the frequency that the episodes come out, the ratings and reviews, and the artwork. And these are sort of the things you see at the top when you have a podcast. And those are the things, some of those things are things that are produced by the podcast creator themselves. For example, the creator makes their own description that invites the user in to listen. On the other hand, as designers of algorithms and recommendation systems, we might think about what could we provide other than things that the creator provided to help them decide whether this is something they'd like to listen to. And I want to drill in a little bit more into the podcast description, since that comes from the creator themselves. How good are those for users deciding whether to listen? Well, we did a little study of that, and we found that if we ask a sample of annotators, how good is this description provided by the creator to help you decide whether or not you want to listen to this podcast? And about half the time the answer was fair or bad. So these creative descriptions are not necessarily the ideal thing you would want to look at to help you decide whether or not to listen to the podcast. On the other hand, some of them are excellent good. So could we use that to learn how to make good descriptions for as explanations for our podcast listeners? And some of them are really, really bad. Just to give you an example of these ones. This is a description that comes from an American football podcast. I think we could approximately say the description is Josh Gordon, which could be a really compelling description if you know who Josh Gordon is. You care who he is, perhaps you're excited that he's back. But if you're new to this podcast, then it really doesn't tell you very much at all. And so that's sort of the kinds of things we're seeing in these fair and bad descriptions when it comes to their value in making a decision about podcast listening. So we decided to look at into this problem a little bit more deeply by trying some summarization. And so the idea with summarization is we want to think of the description of something the creator has written to sort of, it's their impression of what people might want to know about the podcast. But on the other hand, what really happened is what is spoken that we can either get from the transcript. And so here is just a brief depiction of the speech transcript, which we could also denote here, or even the raw audio itself, and generate some kind of summary from that. And then again, the task to decide whether we're successful is could you decide whether to listen based on this summary? And so based on, this is just the first part of a very, very long, I think this is a 60-minute podcast. We're able to summarize that, and I'll talk a little bit more how, into this week, Bill and I talk about our weekend reading habits, what we've been up to, and why Meg Ryan is a rom-com goddess. And so it gives you a little flavor of this podcast, both topically and sort of stylistically. You can see it's a little bit of an informal podcast based on the language here. And so there's a couple of approaches we can take to summarization. Extractive summarization is where we take the phrases or sentences within the podcast that contain the most salient content. And that tends to be things like words that are occurring frequently, or words that are co-occurring with other ones that are occurring frequently. And then identify that based on a graph algorithm, those ones that really seem to be most central to the overall topic, and then select sentences containing those. Then more recently, abstractive summarization is really getting a big boost from recent advances in deep learning and transformers. And we're now able to generate new summary content based on neural generative summarization. And so these could be a big help to our listeners to give them a gist of what the podcast is about, even in those cases where the creator has not been as informative as we might like. And so we can see some sample podcasts. This is the text rank example. And we just looked at this example from Bart Podcast. They can even generate some of the boilerplate for you. And I'm not going to talk about it in detail, but identifying that boilerplate is sort of another interesting sub-problem. So overall, we find that those abstractive summaries perform better than extractive summaries when evaluated on this human judgments of, would this help you decide whether or not to listen to this podcast? They're performing around about the level of their creator and had fewer bad summaries, fewer of those real Josh Gordon shouty summaries. And so this is, I would like to bring up first as one area of research where we're already almost at human level. How could we identify the bad creator podcasts and replace those with automatically generated ones, or even make personalized summaries for our users to help them decide whether to listen to a particular recommendation? So just to sort of dwell on that just for a minute more, we've got an open research problem of explanation. We know there's a high user investment in podcasts. People listen to 30 minutes or more per episode, so that's a really big investment. And the users would like to understand what they're being recommended. So we could think about summarization, audio trailers, or other kinds of explanations. Let's just sort of think a bit more about what else matters to our listeners. This is from a study by Zacchaeus, Larson, and DeRuyker, which they published in JSIST in 2010. And it's really one of the first really significant publications in the podcast research area that we can find. And they looked at a number of different indicators of podcast quality. And so they devised a frame of attributes and manually annotated a small set of podcasts, and then used that to predict iTunes engagement. So for example, whether or not it contained opinions, who the guests were, and so on. Those things were manually annotated. But in that context, they found that the topic of the podcast was important in 68% of preferred podcasts. So that's an important area that we've just been talking about, and summarization may be one way to get at that. But then there are other also very important factors. So for example, the qualities of the podcast themselves, their fluency, whether they hesitate, the speed of their speech was also very relevant. And then also things on the technical execution side. So is there an opening jingle? What are the sound effects? And so something we haven't talked at all so far is properties of speech and audio. They're really important in podcasts, but since it's an audio format. And if we just look at it in terms of either the text metadata provided by the creator or transcripts that we might generate on the audio, we're really losing a lot of the richness that's in there that does matter to people when they're making decisions about listening or to continue listening or to come back to a podcast. And that if we had judgments, those things also presumably would affect their ratings of those podcasts. So I just want to dwell a bit more on this category of the podcaster, how they rate their podcast. We did a study to go into a little bit more depth into that. And one thing we know is that podcast creators are really trying to optimize this kind of thing, and they receive lots of common sense speaking advice to help them connect with their listeners. But we have a question about whether that advice is validated by the data. And some of the advice you'll kind of see is keep it succinct. When choosing your podcast name, shorter is sweeter. Your podcast needs show notes, how to speak slowly on your podcast. Here's the question, should you swear in your podcast? Maybe people don't want to listen to swear words. On the other hand, maybe that makes it sound really authentic. So these are some things that podcasters take into consideration and get advice on. And then as well as being a source of information for the podcast creator themselves, it's also interesting to think about when we're doing content-based recommendations. So we have a new episode of a new podcast show. Would that have broad appeal? And are there some of these stylistic things that could be important in making a recommendation? So we looked into this data in this 100,000 English podcast data set that I mentioned earlier. And we looked at the automatically generated transcripts and the titles and descriptions. Here I'm focusing on the text and the transcripts, and then we'll come to the audio a little later. And we looked at the episode engagement metrics. So what's the rate of for first-time listeners of the podcast? How many of them listen for at least 5 minutes? And the idea is that first-time listeners are going to be perhaps a little less patient with things that might be jarring in a podcast. And so they'll really have a sort of a first gut reaction, but that predicts whether they'll be long-term listeners to that podcast as well. And we pre-processed the podcasts. I mentioned earlier, we can identify some of the boilerplate or ads in the descriptions. And then we trained LDA to get 100 topics over the podcast data set. And we ran some part of speech tagging and also identified emotion words using a lexicon, and then also looked at some low-level audio features. And so some of the stylistic features we looked at are things that are mentioned in advice to podcast creators, such as the length of the podcast, the relevance of the description, emotion words that are being used, fillers and disfluencies, that's things like ums and ahs, swearing and vocabulary diversity, ads, speech rate, and parts of speech. And so just to sort of summarize what the advice says, and then we'll kind of test whether we think those things really do bear out. The length here is in terms of the length. The description should be succinct, but kept informative. Swearing should be either avoided or a small amount of it kept for character. The description relevance should be relevant to the podcast. The emotions expressed in the podcast should be upbeat and positive. So that's pretty prescriptive. You could imagine having a podcast where you have less positive things to say about events of the day or so on. So it's sort of interesting to see how often this is true. Filters and disfluencies, those are the ums and ahs. Vocabulary diversity, distinctiveness, and then speech rate is recommended to speak slowly. And so we divided our data into 4 quartiles, partly because the most popular podcasts do have the greatest listening rate, but this way we can look for the lowest quarter of popularity, what distinguishes there for the next quartile, and so on. And in fact, most of that advice to podcast creators is validated. So compared to lower engagement episodes, high engagement ones do have long and relevant descriptions. They do have fewer ads in their transcripts. They do have more show notes and ads and less swearing. They've got higher vocabulary diversity and reading grade levels. And they do have more positive emotions and few negative emotions. But there are some new insights that are contrary to what is the typical recommendation to podcast creators. So high engagement ones have lower distinctiveness. That means their vocabulary, as distinguished by cross entropy, is relatively more ordinary choice of words. Their speech is faster. They have fewer filler words, but only in the lowest popularity quartile. And they have more adverbs and conjunctions and fewer nouns and pronouns. And so, what does that mean? Fewer nouns and pronouns means less of I and you and he and she, and more of frequently and so on. So it's something about the way they're speaking. And it may be that it's more technical and less personal in this case. Actually, I haven't got the data here, but in general, the speech in podcasts is very, very personal. This is a lot more pronouns, first person pronouns like I and we, compared to, say, written language or other kind of language. So then if we use that textual content to try and predict engagement, our baseline is 50% because we did a 50-50 split on the data. Using the stylistic features, we can get 71% accuracy. Using TF-IDF, we can get a 76% accuracy. And then BERT, over all of these features, we can get up to 80% accuracy at predicting the level of engagement. So it shows that there's really a lot of relevant information in the textual content that predicts engagement. And I want to step back for a minute. I haven't got a separate slide about this, just to say, often when we think about recommending, we think about collaborative filtering as one of our sort of first tools we use, because it's a really powerful one. But on the other hand, if we've got a podcast that doesn't have any listening history, and I'll bring this up again later, looking at the textual context can be a really valuable piece of information. And so I think combining those things is something that would be good for us to look in further work. So the takeaways from this section here is that most podcast creation advice is validated by the data, and linguistic content can distinguish between high and low stream rate podcasts. So what else matters to listeners? We've talked about the topical content, we've talked a little bit about the podcaster and how they speak. And then the other category I'd really like to spend a little while on is what Sokias, Larson, and DeRiker called technical execution, but here I want to focus on it as audio because it's aspects about the sound of like deliberately inserted sounds like opening jingles, inadvertent sounds like background noise, editing effects, and so on. And those things also have an impact on listener happiness with the podcasts. So let's just talk a little bit about this problem of using podcast audio. One thing we know from some research that Young and colleagues did and published in Wisdom 2019 is that popular podcasts have higher audio energy. So they built a data set that we alluded to a little bit earlier that had podcast episodes distinguished by high and low popularity, and then computed some features on that raw audio signal, and were able to distinguish, especially using energy, although the seriousness did not seem to have as much of an impact on the predictive power for predicting popularity. So combining the audio features with text could be a really valuable thing in the podcast recommendation. But I think this is still an open area. There's a lot of work still to be done in audio. A little bit more has been done in the context of the TREC podcast track, which has been running for the last 2 years. There, we made available podcast data set and then defined a task over that, a search task, which we describe as segment retrieval. Find the most relevant 2-minute set long podcast from a large set of podcast segments. Sorry, not 2-minute long podcast, 2-minute long segment of a podcast. And then also summarization. And this is the problem we were talking about earlier. And one way to think about how audio could impact this, we've talked about the summarization task as a text summarization problem and returning a text snippet that captures the most important content. But another piece that we've added to this evaluation this year is asking the participants to identify an audio file of up to 1 minute duration to give the user a sense of what the podcast sounds like. And we don't yet have that data evaluated yet, but this is something that could be, again, really very valuable to understand what's important to the listener, and as a form of explanation, an audio summary can be a form of explanation to users to give them a preview of a podcast before they decide to commit that large amount of time to listening. So now I'm going to just talk very briefly over a couple of other areas that I think are open problems. So search is really important to recommendation, and I just want to, well, sorry, I've gone back to my my Amsterdam example here. So in this case, I searched for Amsterdam. I got a variety of results of lots of different kinds, language learning ones. This one here, New York City history. This is because Amsterdam matches life in New Amsterdam, which is an old-fashioned name for New York. So you can see there's all sorts of things going on in the search results. And without like a clear explanation of why these things are coming up, or without some way of tailoring these more to me, it can be really challenging to choose the things I want to listen to. Here's an example from Netflix, which I think is kind of interesting. I suppose I should have picked out an Amsterdam example, but here, when you go on Netflix and search for a movie, in this case that they don't have, they show you titles related to that movie. So here's lots of different, the movie I was looking for is Wall-E, they don't have it, but they show me lots of different other movies that I could watch instead of that. And so I just want to kind of emphasize that search and recommended are really very related. Often we think of them as sort of separate tasks, but when in a search context, we might want to return recommendations. And in a recommendation task, we might want to think about how a user's past search pertains to that. So just to sort of come back to the TREC task that we set up, one of the tasks was a search task, retrieving these 2-minute segments for a search query. Based in part on looking at some of these other things that we think are important to listeners, we've added some new ranking criteria this year. So we not only are looking for whether the episodes are relevant to the topic description, but also things like, are they entertaining? Are they subjective? And is it a discussion? And so these are sort of things that sort of take into account some of these other things that we know could be, are interesting to the user. And we need to sort of start thinking about what kind of data do we have to do with that? And how do we generate algorithms that kind of approach the problem in this way? So then the last, or I think last or penultimate research problem I'd like to bring up is recommending the tail. So one of the things we know, it comes up again and again, is that word of mouth drives podcast listening. And one of the reasons for that is that new podcasts come out, they don't necessarily have a lot of listening history, and people aren't able to find them in podcast recommenders that primarily focus on collaborative filtering. And it's the classic problem we have of cold start and warm start, and it's no different for podcasts. We have seen some research applying recommendation to cold start podcast users who have some other interaction with the app. So for example, Narazi and colleagues published in CIR 2020 some work about using music listening history as a way to represent some of the things about a user that might predict their podcast listening history. And Yang and colleagues published in 2019 some interesting work about the onboarding. So when you sign up for a podcast app, it can kind of ask you what categories you're interested in, and those aspirational listening goals can drive better recommendation and also help explaining the recommendations you receive. So that's kind of interesting, both in a kind of warm start or let's say cold start setting, and then also in a explanation setting. Now, when we have, that's for the whole show, when we have cold start episodes, we might want to piggyback on the show information. So this is a popular show, or the show is about this, but it falls down a little bit when the episode, maybe the podcast differs in topic from episode to episode, or it might just be a really not very good episode from this show. And so if we can have some other way of knowing something about what's going on there, that could be valuable. And then cold start shows, this is really an open challenge there. The question of fairness to creators comes up. And actually in our panel a little bit later, I think some of our podcast creator panelists are going to talk a little bit about that, about how when they make their show, they'd really like to make sure it's heard by the audience who would be interested in that. And if it's always the most famous podcasts that are getting all the listeners, then both the creators are not getting the audience that they might like to reach, and also the listeners might not be finding the best podcast for their interests. So I think that thinking about how we can recommend tail podcasts or cold start podcasts is a really interesting and important challenge. And then finally, very briefly, just to talk a little bit about success metrics for podcast recommendation. One thing we know is that various podcast listening apps provide data for the podcast creators. So for example, if you're a creator, you can go into Spotify Podcasters and see your start and stream data, your listener and follow data, there's podcast charts available. And so the creators can use that to sort of see within themselves, this episode is more popular than that other episode, and think about how they might make some improvements if they can come up with changes they might want to make. But what we don't know is how those things relate to user satisfaction. And I'm hard pressed to think of any studies that have gone in any great detail about user satisfaction, except by taking the podcast charts, saying, okay, a popular thing is perhaps a higher satisfaction podcast, and a lower popular podcast relates to lower user satisfaction. But obviously we know that people have very diverse interests, and popular may just be pertain to more people's interests rather than being sort of quality for individual users. So just to sort of wrap up, I'd like to acknowledge my colleagues at Spotify, also Gareth Jones and Maria Eskovich, Sravan Reddy, who have collaborated on a lot of this work, and have also included work by other people not at Spotify. And to kind of sum up some of these open research directions that I think would be great for us to discuss in the workshop today, and also think about how we could integrate into our research into the future, include evaluating podcast recommendations, explanations, and how we can help the user understand why they got a particular recommendation. Using audio in recommendation, I think, is a really under-tapped area. Recommending the tail, both from the point of view of fairness and from the point of view of cold start problem, and then search and recommendation for podcasts, and thinking about how those things interrelate. I think are other really important areas for us to consider. So now I'd like to turn it over to Gareth, I think, who's going to bring us into our activity.
Thanks very much for that presentation, Rosie. I mean, we often, after a keynote, we would take Q&A, but we decided today that perhaps we would try and dive into the questions and the challenges that Rosie raised in a bit more detail via some discussions in breakout rooms. So for the next, so this is a relatively short session of discussion. So we have this in the schedule for 45 minutes. So we'll try and put you into some, or we'll find you into some breakout rooms, and then spend some time in the breakout rooms, and then come back and have a discussion, or have some report back on what you've seen. So perhaps we could have the next slide. Okay, yeah, so actually that's just summarizing what I'm saying. So the idea is to try and progress some of those challenges with some more concrete ideas of sort of reach out to the community of people who are interested in podcasts and recommendation of podcasts, and getting people in to access podcasts which they find useful. And then the third slide. It was going so well and we lost the slide presentation somehow there. Yeah, so this is just fleshing out the topics that Rosie was talking about a bit. So recommending the tail, so the fairness of making podcasts available to people. The idea that you can do everything with collaborative filtering, particularly when you've got either new content or you've got sort of niche areas where you haven't got large numbers of users where you can reliably suggest things, but also the fact that the diversity can be lost if you just focus on popularity. And then use of audio features, so stepping beyond the text transcripts that we might have and the metadata that's provided with a podcast, to think about how we might determine whether podcasts should be recommended, whether people are more likely to find them interesting, what sorts of features can we find relationships between the features that appear in podcasts and the types of things that individual users might like to find interesting. And then the topic of explanation, which goes
a lot beyond what I think people would often think of in terms of snippet summaries that you might get out of a search engine. As Rosie was emphasizing, listening to a podcast is a big investment for people. So we need to be able to guide them reliably to find good podcasts, or podcasts that they're going to find interesting, that's going to be worth their investment of time. So people need to know what's being recommended to them, why it's being recommended to them. Can we put together not just text snippets, but can we put together useful audio trailers and things like that? And it's those are just, I mean, topics and ideas that Rosie raised. I mean, I think we can go beyond that in terms of what people might like and what we might provide them with. And then the topic of search. So if you haven't actually got the perfect item to recommend, can we search for other things which might be useful? And then something that a lot of the collaboration that between that Rosie was mentioning before was focused on, and that's evaluating. What would be the features of a recommendation data set that could be shared between people to study topics here, and what are the metrics of success? We might look at standard measures of precision and recall, but probably there are a much greater range of useful and potentially user-based metrics that we could look at there. So, what we need to do at this point is to consider now. Okay, I should say something on this. So you need to think about which problem you would like to work on, which was most attractive. Hopefully, you'll find at least one of those problems interesting. We were planning to use the new Zoom feature of self-select breakout rooms, but we understand that perhaps some people haven't got that available at the moment. So if some rooms become very large, now I think some of my co-hosts are going to help manage this. We need to set up the breakout rooms, and then get them breaking out. So welcome back from the breakout rooms. Sorry about a little bit of chaos at the beginning there. Hopefully you found your way to some interesting discussions. We note that several people moved around between different breakout rooms, and that's just fine. Hopefully you're able to listen and contribute to a number of different topics. So at this point, we'd like some short reports. So we asked each topic area in each breakout room to hopefully have nominated somebody who can say a few words about what you were talking about, and probably by the time we've through that, we'll get to the end of the session. But if there is a little bit of time left at the end, then maybe we'll have a bit of Q&A. And hopefully, if somebody has made some notes during your discussions, it'd be really great if you could send that on to the chairs. If you're either you could send them to myself and Rosie and Qingwei, or just one of us. And so we'll try and use those just to help summarize the discussions in an overall report on this workshop that we prepare. So at this point, we'll perhaps go through the topics that Rosie raised, and I'll perhaps take them in reverse order. Well, reverse order of one of the lists. That's okay. Let's go in the order in this list, which wasn't the order that Rosie had in her presentation. So how about people who are looking at recommending the tail with fairness and situations where collaborative filtering doesn't solve your problems in terms of recommending podcasts? Is anyone able to talk about that? You can unmute yourself if you want to talk, please.
I was in that room, but I would like to see if anyone else from that room can also talk. I'm going to wait for a minute, for a few seconds, to see if anyone else.
You didn't have a named person ahead of time.
Which room?
Recommending the tail. I joined a little bit later, so I'm wondering if there was someone assigned.
As far as I know, there was no one that's.
Oh, okay. So if you could summarize a bit, and maybe somebody else who is involved, if there's anything you miss out that's important, then they could chip in.
So should I go ahead, Gareth?
Yes, go ahead, please. Yes.
Yes, definitely. So,
yeah, sure.
And please add from that room. The part I was involved with the discussion, there was a question. So it sounded like there is this main problem with a long tail that we need to be kind of assuring about the quality of the content. So that's one part that's a big challenge. And after having the quality, the question is that who you should recommend this content to, which gets into understanding the content better and being able to elicit preferences of the users and assign these long tail items to recommend these long tail items to the users. There were a couple of really interesting experiences that were brought up. Someone mentioned that they have seen a correlation between measuring the coverage of a recommendation and the long-term satisfaction of the users. So it's really interesting. That sounds like if you move away from popularity, you're going to actually get more satisfied users as well. This is not clear in every domain. So it was, I think, an interesting point that was brought up with one of our participants. The other, I think someone else also mentioned they have been also kind of diversifying their content in their podcast recommendation. That also has resulted in better engagement and more satisfaction from the users. In terms of how to do that, we talked a little bit about content-based recommendations, like how to use the content of a show to recommend them to the users. These are the parts I remember. So if anyone from that room wants to add, would be great.
Yeah, so if you have anything to add, just unmute yourself and
Yeah, and I think that covered quite a lot of what we talked about. I guess we talked a lot about just the problems of how it's hard to recommend for the tail.
Okay, so we'll move on to the second topic. So use of audio, so getting beyond just using transcripts and text and metadata for recommendation to podcasts. Can anyone give us a report on those discussions?
Yep, I took notes. Talk about a few things. One thing is actually related to the long tail and fairness. Talking about automatic speech recognition, ASR, and how much of podcast recommendations is going to depend on this, where we sometimes take for granted. ASR has improved a lot in the recent years, but there are still biases and issues with certain segments of humanity who are not the performance that have higher error rates, and so it is still an open area, just ASR for podcasts. We talked a lot about audio quality and the production quality that goes into making a podcast, and you have everything from like garage podcasters to like large funded podcast companies who have large marketing budgets, and so there's an interesting like confounding there of is it the quality of the audio, or is it the quality of the show, or the quality of the marketing budget that makes something a popular show or not, but also that it's not more is better always. With audio quality, I think some people mentioned there's a threshold at a certain point you can have like a fancy rig and people don't notice, there's not much of a difference beyond a certain point. And so how much is enough for audio quality? And also maybe in some cases, the lower the quality, the more attractive it is to certain segments of an audience. And this goes back to just like general recommendation or personal taste, which is, people do like creativity, they like uniqueness, and listening to someone who has a different voice than than the majority. Maybe a podcast with a lower audio quality, like production quality, like those could be things that actually draw people into certain shows. We have examples of this, in all media, where it's there's a large audience for kind of unique content, and so it's audio quality is not just a more is better. Those are the two big things, I think. Lots of challenges, of course, for audio, and I can share the notes.
Right, that's great. Anyone want to add anything else to what Cheng-Wei has reported? Okay, so I guess we can move on. We didn't notice a lot of interest or a lot of activity in the explanation topic, and so if anyone wants to report that, we're really interested to hear. But we might move on if there is no report on that. No? Okay, so
I wanted to talk about like something. So for podcast, so for podcast summarization, we can do so. Like for podcasts with higher budgets, they already have a trailer to the entire season, or a specific in the part of a specific episode. They talk about what has happened and what we will discuss in the specific podcast. So instead of a summarization, we could allow users to like select the part which is to be later put into as a clip or like to recommend users, like a short clip from the podcast rather than making a entirely new audio from by editing from different parts of it.
Sure, and so that those would be constructed manually?
Yes.
Okay.
No, manually, no. We just select some specific part from a podcast. Like if they already have like an introduction, we could like give like many podcasts are introductions. Like so, users can specifically select a time interval which is to be made a clip.
Okay. Okay. Thanks for that. So maybe move to the next topic, which is use of search with recommendation in podcasts. Can somebody give us some comments on that?
Yeah, I have some notes on this group. So we were talking about first how search of an event is a hard problem, not searching of the title or searching about the host or whatever, but searching about a specific event that may happen and the user may have interest on that event but doesn't know where to find that in the podcast. That's something we were discussing a bit. And then we were talking about kind of Shazam, but for podcasts. No, if there is some initiative for that, or what would be the scenario where someone would need to use a kind of a Shazam for podcasts. So putting a phone app that is able to identify the podcast and then you can play. But it's a different scenario, no? So you are not generally listening in a place where there is a podcast and you want to identify it, but maybe we want to identify what the people is talking about and then finding a podcast that is similar to that. So we were talking also about the conversational systems that are listening to people, maybe to provide ads also that can be to recommend podcasts. But it's, of course, it's a bit creepy to have the conversational assistant listening to you to recommend podcasts. But maybe if you ask your system specifically for that because you want that, then maybe it's not that creepy. That's something we're talking about. Also, we mentioned the need of an open database of podcasts, like Music Brains for music or IMDb for films. This came from the example that RecSys put about the Wall-E in Netflix. Now that you don't have that title, but you want to find similar, so there is not such a open database where you have all the episodes, all the shows different, and the people that is in those shows. That can be something very interesting for the community. Also, automatic identification of speakers is another thing. Like you are listening to some podcast, whatever, and you want to know who is speaking at a certain moment, and also have more information about that speaker. It's also something that could be interesting. And finally, there was this idea of having a thumbnail, visual thumbnail of a podcast. Like in YouTube, you have the videos, and people made up these thumbnails where you really explain what is in the video in one image or something related to that, but for podcasts, and maybe automatic generation of those thumbnails too for search. Yeah, more or less those were the topics and the ideas we were discussing.
Okay, thanks very much. I guess in the interest of time, we need to move on. The topic of evaluating podcasts or recommendation and of podcasts. Does anyone give us a report on those discussions?
Yeah, I took some notes. So there is like two main points. The first one was raised by Michael and Francesco that are going to present a paper later. It was on data availability. I mean, there is it seems difficult to have a setup, and for academic, more difficult to have a setup of data to make experiment on podcast recommendation. So basically, they need to build a internal study if they want to do something, or ask industry and make a deal to have access to data. Another aspect that was taken account around this data was it's important to have player data, like the player of the podcast that will provide things to make some implicit rating and do all the recommender things. So that's another aspect on the data point. And after we talk about more like on the podcast recommendation setup, what could be difficult to do for the evaluation. So the first one was basically to have review at the episode level. It's kind of different of song or movie. We are close like a TV show, for example. So it's important to have this kind of information at an episode and not only as a series. The pandemic period, like the last 2 years, have I think make evolve the consumption of podcast from a listener perspective and a creator perspective. Maybe Spotify has some insight on it to share. There is also the fact that some podcasts are impacted by the news. So basically the subject that is talk in a podcast could be a dividing topic. So it's maybe something that you should not put in your evaluation and put aside. The fact that basically on some platform you don't have exactly the same experience. For example, in YouTube, if you listen to a podcast, you can rate with a thumbs up, thumb down a podcast, where on Spotify you cannot do it. Same thing for the time code features. On YouTube, you can jump on specific part of the podcast, and on Spotify I think it's not possible, but I may be wrong on that. And the last factor was basically the fact that podcast can be posted on multiple platforms, and basically you can start to listen, for example, on Spotify, and after you can continue on YouTube because you want to watch specific aspect of the podcast that need to have the video to watch. So it's something that you need to take in account in your evaluation. And that's it.
Okay, thanks very much for that kind of a succinct review of the discussions. So we're now at the end of the session. I think in the interests of the program, we need to move on. Thanks very much for your discussions. Thanks very much for the report backs. Hope it was interesting to spend some time looking at the topics that Rosie raised earlier on. So we're now due a short break before the presentation of the papers. I would suggest, unless Chingwei tells me otherwise, that we maybe start back at 10 to the hour rather than in 15 minutes, rather than 15 to the hour. So you get a 15-minute break from now to make some coffee, stretch your legs, or catch up with anything else you need to catch up with. And we'll come back officially at 1650, I'm sorry. But obviously you're in your own local time zone.
The first paper will be from Francesco from the University of Strathclyde, and he'll talking about how to build a podcast collection with user interactions. And Francesco, I think you can take over and share slides from your end.
Yeah, cheers. I'll try to share my screen here. Hopefully it doesn't fail on me again. Okay. Should be able to see my screen now?
Yeah.
Perfect. So hi everyone. My name is Francesco Meggetto. I am a PhD candidate at the University of Strathclyde in Glasgow, UK. It's in sort of cloudy Scotland right now. So in this talk, I'm going to present our position paper, which is titled On Building a Podcast Collection with User Interactions. This work has been done at the New Research Lab in collaboration with also my supervisor, Dr. Yashar Moshfeghi, and Dr. Rosie Jones. No presentation is needed. She was the keynote, but Director of Research in Language Technologies at Spotify in Boston, the US. So, okay, so in this presentation, I'm going first to give a very brief introduction to podcasts and then briefly discuss why they are a very complex domain. Then I will move on to the Spotify Podcast Dataset and its main limitation, which is the lack of user behavior, user interactions. Then I will move on to our proposal, which is to kind of create a new collection with user interactions, an augmentation of the existing dataset. And then I'm going to discuss various experimental approaches that we have identified. And I will conclude with some final conclusions and some final remarks on a community effort to make this work possible. So podcasts have actually been around for quite some time, at least from the early 2000s with the iPod, but only recent years they have sort of exploded in popularity. As an example, as of 2021, this year, there are over 1 million active podcasts and over 30 million episodes in more than 100 languages. In the US, 75% of the population is familiar with the term podcast, 55 have listened to at least one, and 37 are monthly listeners. What this means is that all in all, they are now an essential part of listening habits, together with, for example, music, a more well-established domain, and also more research. However, they are a quite complex domain. Podcasts are spoken audio-only documents, but they are substantially different from other spoken document corpora that were analyzed in the past. For example, music or even movies or news, etc. For example, episodes in podcasts are on average between half an hour and 1 hour long, and this places them in between what we can find in music and what we can find in movies or TV series. Podcasts have also a wide range of style, format, language variety, and variations that make their analysis very, very challenging. For example, it was mentioned before, some episodes may have one speaker, some episodes may have two speakers, or even three speakers that may speak simultaneously. And also another example is that category labels that are given by podcast creators are oftentimes unreliable. And this makes, for example, search quite a more complicated task than what it already is. So all of these challenges make their analysis complex, and therefore it is a very complex, but also under-researched domain. To facilitate research, in 2020, Spotify released the Spotify Podcast Dataset. Rosie already mentioned this dataset, but very briefly, it is a very large corpus of podcast episodes, 100,000 of them, roughly, a bit more. And this is about 2 terabytes of data. Each episode includes an audio file, that's why it's very large, automatically transcribed text, which is done by the Google APIs, and associated metadata. The dataset was also released in conjunction with the TREC podcast track with 2 shared tasks that were set, segment retrieval and episode summarization. It is a great and amazing opportunity to advance the field, but what we find is that its main limitation is that it lacks of user contextual information and also their interaction history with the system, and in this case, Spotify. And this makes its applicability to certain tasks, for example, recommendation or user behavior analysis, difficult or even impractical, as is the case of user behavior analysis. So what we propose is then to build a complementary data set of podcast listening sessions. The aim of this project, of this proposal, of this idea, is to build and then release a new general purpose collection for academic research. This is to be thought of not as a data set for single studies, but rather for the entire community to progress the field in the years to come. It can also be thought of as an augmentation of the existing Spotify podcast dataset by including these user interactions data, as to form these listening sessions. An example of a listening session could be, we have user ID, we have timestamps, we have listening time, and then some user behavior, for example, the play, stop, subscribe, pause, skip forward, skip backwards, etc. If this project is successful, it will open up a wide range of research opportunities in the communities, including analysis on, but it's not only limited to, information needs, analysis on characteristics and behavior of users, episode relevance, and as well as recommendation and personalization and search. So to do so, we have identified 3 approaches that I'm going to briefly introduce here. But we are open for discussion and also on finding the best approach to make this work possible. The first approach that we propose is user simulation. This idea came from the recent work of Young and colleagues in 2019 at Wisdom, where they basically showed that podcast representation can be enriched by modeling non-textual characteristics. And their model, adversarial learning model, is able to predict seriousness, energy, and popularity. And so what we propose is a user simulation that is driven by the most recent findings in users' listening patterns and consumption. However, what we realize is that this approach is not a momentarily straightforward or even unbiased process. This is because, put in simple terms, there is a scarcity of research at the moment in users modeling for podcasts. And so this approach is rather difficult. Therefore, what we propose instead is to perform a laboratory-based user study. This study, the aim of this study is to collect user interactions from real participants. So this is a study that will be done in a controlled environment. And so what we're able to do is that we are able to actually exploit real users' behavior, because we have real participants and not artificial behavior. This also gives us high experimental control so that we can test various hypotheses that we may have. However, the problem with that is that it has high time requirements, meaning that a data set may take some time to be produced, to be generated. And also it is a small scale study, given the low number of participants that we can recruit. And what this means is that it is in contrast, in opposition to our stated goal of building a general purpose collection for the community. Therefore, what we propose is that our third approach, which is crowdsourcing based. The aim of this study is very similar to the one I just mentioned, the laboratory based one, but now participants are recruited in a different way, either by crowdsourcing, for example, Amazon Mechanical Turk, or from selected academic communities such as this one here, PodRecs, SIGIR, RecSys, etc. In the first case, however, we believe it is unfeasible for 2 reasons. The first one is the associated cost. It can become really, really expensive. But secondly, the results that we may get might be unreliable and inaccurate. This is because we ask Turkers to just perform the task. And so what this means is that this may lead to an untruthful reflection of users' information needs. So what we believe to be the sort of best approach is to recruit from the academic communities. But to do so, we need a community effort from all of you. In terms of the design of the experiment, participants will be asked to interact with an ad hoc system, a website and a mobile application, with basic functionalities and also a basic facade that resemble and are very similar to existing modern screening platforms. This is done to allow for high familiarity with the system by the users. We identified two possible approaches on how participants can navigate through the system, either by search or by recommendation. So in the first case, in the first scenario, in search, users, the participants can freely search and listen to episodes they deem relevant or interesting. And this is done by user-defined search queries. And this means that users have control over the content they would like to stream. So they can freely search on the list of available episodes and shows. In the second case, in recommendation, we need a built-in system, a built-in recommender system that recommends a list of episodes from which then the users can choose from. However, this adds extra challenges to the already many of building this collection. And also it requires explicit collection of users' interest. However, this can be done by a questionnaire prior to the experiment start. Now, moving on to the type of data that we may want to collect, we have, of course, the explicit and then the implicit type of feedback. For the explicit one, we identified two approaches on how to collect such feedback. And this is done by item relevance judgment. So the first case is single item judgment, and the second is multi-item judgment. In the first one, after each listening, the user is asked to rate the content, is asked by the system to rate the content on a scale 1 to 5. So from very bad to very good. And optionally, maybe also say why, on a text box or something like that. What this does is that it will generate a sort of collection that will be similar to for example, movie lens or similar data sets. In the second case, multi-item judgment, now after listening to 2 or more episodes, the user is asked to rank them in order of preference. And so depending on which approach that we take, the data set that will be generated will be substantially different. Lastly, in terms of the implicit type of feedback, actually the types are many. There are many types of interactions that we may want to collect. And so a selection of the best set is left for this discussion from also what the community thinks we really need. However, some examples could be, the listening time, the dwell time, consumption level, start, end time, and then there is also, a subscribe, play, stop, pause, skip forward, skip backwards, etc. So in conclusion, our goal, that is also a community goal, is to generate a general purpose data set of podcast listening sessions. Again, this is, as I said before, this is to be thought of as not a data set for a single study or 2 studies, but rather for the entire community to take advantage of. It is without any doubt very ambitious, but without any doubt there are lots of challenges involved. Some examples on some factors that we may want to consider when we design the experiment are the total number of episodes, the 100K, and also their length in nature. In the first case, the number of episodes, we may want to reduce the number of available episodes by sampling, by creating a sub-collection. However, it is very important to keep in mind, if you do so, that there are major differences across episodes in terms of length or topic, style, etc. And so it is crucial when you design that sampling strategy to account for all of this. And most importantly, to not introduce various biases into the process. For example, the popularity bias. In the second factor, in the second case, the length in nature, we believe that maybe a better approach would be to only retrieve small and relevant sections, and only those should be available for listening by the participants. This is done to keep a high level of user engagement by the participants. Otherwise, it becomes too lengthy of a process. All in all, however, we call for a community effort to make this work possible. So if you have any other suggestions or if you have other ideas in mind, please feel free to reach out. So I hope I was on time. Thank you very much for listening. Again, if you have any questions or suggestions, or if you're open for a collaboration, please feel free to reach out via email at my email address, francesco.meggetto@strafacuk. Thank you very much for listening. If you have any questions, I'm here.
Great. Thanks, Francesco. And any questions from the audience? I hear something. Please go ahead. Go ahead.
You were talking about an open data set. So could we like aggregate the existing data sets into a bigger data set for users to analyze from?
Yeah, so yeah, that's basically our idea, to augment the existing data set released by Spotify last year. And this is basically, in simple words, adding user interactions data in there.
I was talking about aggregating various podcast data set, aggregating
various data sets.
Yes, like a list of podcasts into one.
I'm not sure I fully get your question. Sorry.
So like music videos also are released on YouTube as well as on Spotify, but on YouTube I think there are more music videos than on Spotify, because on YouTube there are like people release it more because it's the biggest platform. So like aggregating means like combining from various like Spotify dataset and any other dataset that is publicly available.
Right. Yeah. So our aim here is, I believe, just for podcasts, but it can also be considered to be for other mediums. But for example, for music, there is already a data set by Spotify, the music streaming sessions, where they basically have sort of these defined listening sessions with user behavior on how people, for example, skip the content, etc. So we try to make this work only related to podcasts, to make it only the research only for podcast related, but it can also be absolutely, you can include other various sources. And also the podcasts that are available in the data set, I believe, are podcasts from Spotify, but are available everywhere as well, at least some of them, unless they are Spotify, only for Spotify.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you.
Hi, Francesco.
Hello.
Thanks for the talk. I did have a question. You're talking about a community effort among, you sort of mixed the idea of Amazon Turk and sort of a wide open audience for this. And you're looking, it sounds more toward the researcher audience to try to collect data from. And I'm just wondering how, we're not really a neutral audience who, those of us who already study podcasts and are looking at this, we may have varied interests across the spectrum, but I kind of imagine that our listening habits and preferences are not really indicative of the wider audience. Do you think there's going to be much problem there?
Yes, thank you for your question. That's a very good point, actually. So yes, it might introduce some problems because, as you just said, it's just a sort of a small sample of population. You can call it that way, I guess. So the main problem with the crowdsourcing-based idea is that you just sort of ask random strangers to perform a task, and then maybe they don't do it properly, So that's why we don't want that approach. We want something that is actually a true reflection of users' behavior, of real users. So it might be that we recruit from these selected communities of researchers, but also from other maybe local communities around, different cities. For example, here I'm in Glasgow, some from Glasgow, some from London, some in the US, etc. But the main point is that we want to really get real users' behavior and not just something fake. You know what I mean? I hope that answers the question. But yeah, it's a very great question. Thank you for that.
Next up will be Mikkel from the Technical University of Denmark, and he will be talking about topic model robustness to automatic speech recognition errors in podcast transcripts. So Mikkel, the stage is yours.
Yes, I'm just going to try and share my screen here. Let me know if you can see it. Should be able to see some slides here, I believe.
Yeah.
Okay, very good. Yeah, so my name is Mikkel Jordan. I am a PhD student at the Technical University of Denmark. But this was actually done in my previous employment, which was also at DTU, this research. But anyways, it was done in collaboration with two Danish companies. Also, one is called ISMIR, and ISMIR is a smaller startup that has done some very promising ASR technology in Danish in particular. And it was also done in collaboration with Podimo, which is a podcast service provider for users in Denmark. I'm very happy to be able to present the research today that we've done together, which is called, it's a bit of a long title, but topic modeling robustness to automatic speech recognition errors in podcast transcripts. And just to give sort of a little teaser, the goal of the research was to investigate what level of ASR technology how high of quality of ASR technology do we actually need to get meaningful and relatively high quality of topic distributions on transcript acquired through ASR in podcasts. And so just a bit of background and motivation, as already been said many times today, and I think we're all aware of, is that we have this increasingly large amount of podcasts available to users. And one of the key questions for service providers, for podcast providers, is how do we automatically recommend content to users that is meaningful to them and that they want to listen to? And the key word here is, of course, automatically, because as the content pool grows, it's hard to do manual recommendations, for example. And especially for a language like Danish, which is not particularly large, 5.5 million native speakers, I believe. How do we do this in a low resource language where technology is not as mature as it is, for example, in English? And what are the levels of maturity that we actually require in in Danish in order to be able to do so? And when we're talking maturity in technology, it's in particular with regards to NLP technology, for example. So one of the issues that we face here is also this lack of metadata for podcasts that might not be there if content providers do not create it themselves. And then, as I mentioned, that technology is not mature. Here we go. Sorry. And so there's of course a large number of factors that affect recommendations, but the thing that we wanted to target here was this the recommendation factor, which is like the topic of the podcast. As Rosie previously mentioned, that this is like one of the primary things that users look for in the new content they're looking for is the topic of the podcast. So that is the focus of what we're doing here. So yeah, we basically investigate the maturity level required from automatic speech recognition for good topic modeling. And the way we do this is that we obtain some baseline transcripts from podcast audio, And then we artificially inject noise into these baseline transcripts at an increasing rate. And then we see how this affects the topic distributions that we obtain from the transcripts. So in order to do this, we basically needed, there was 3 primary areas that we had to address for our experiment, which I'll explain in a minute. But basically the first one is we needed to obtain some baseline transcripts, which basically is the best obtainable transcripts that we can get for this audio. The second thing we needed was some ways to inject transcription errors into our baseline transcripts. So basically a way of artificially increasing the errors in our transcripts. And then the third thing we needed is we needed to create some topic models in order to obtain these topic distributions on the transcripts. And then finally, we needed to have some evaluation method of the topic distributions. So basically, obtaining the topic distributions in themselves is not enough on the transcripts. We also need to see are these actually close to the true topic of the podcast. And so first, the way we obtain these baseline transcripts, right? Ideally, what we would have wanted was a true script, for example, from the podcast, the content creator. But in the data pool that we have in Danish that we had available, we did not have enough baseline transcripts that was actually provided by the content producers. So instead, what we did is that we use ISMIR's dense speech recognition system to obtain these baseline transcripts. And I won't go too much into detail with that, but the idea is basically that the baseline transcripts is the output from the dense speech technology. And so we treat these as the baseline, the best obtainable transcripts. So then the second part is this about how do we actually get to simulate transcription errors in a good way, so we can sort of inject them into these baseline transcripts and make them more and more erroneous. And one very basic way, which is quite obvious, is just to use some uniform random kind of noise where we basically just replace a word with any word. So yeah, I should say that the way we do this is that we select some beta value here, which basically ranges from 0 to 1, and that is the frequency at which we corrupt a word in our transcript, in these baseline transcripts. But yeah, so just to go back, sorry, is that we have these, the first and basic method is the uniform random noise method, where we just randomly sample some Danish word from some big corpus and then replace a word in the baseline transcript with this randomly sampled word. But the more interesting approach is this, where we sort of have modeled noise from typical errors made in an ASR system. And then we try to model the types of noise that are made by ASR. And then we try to increase the rate of these ASR errors occurring in a script. And the way we did this is basically we had, so we have some audiobooks where we have accompanying scripts, and we know that these are the correct scripts for the audiobooks, and we align, and then what we do is we use the same technology, the dense speech technology, to create transcripts from the audiobooks, and then we align these two transcripts with each other and see where errors occur. Okay. And then basically what we get is some conditional distribution, which says, given some specific word, in this case, W, what is the likelihood that the error that is made is W bar? So in this case, you can see here, we have the word nogensinde in Danish, and you have some error candidates here, which is what we've seen in this large corpus of audiobooks. And you can see the typical errors that are made for nogensinde here, and the probability of them occurring. So what happens when we corrupt these transcripts is basically we have some beta value, and whenever we choose a word has to be corrupted, we make a lookup in our conditional distribution and look for an error seen, and we sample an error candidate. So that is how we model the noise, and that is how we inject transcription errors. Finally, we had to do these topic models, and basically the way we do this is that we just create an LDA model on an external multi-domain text corpus. In our case, it's Wikidata in Danish, and we tune these topic models on this wiki data set. And then what we can do is with this model, we can take any document D and input it to the LDA model. We can obtain some topic distribution of this document. And then the second question then becomes, how do we evaluate the topic distributions we obtain on the transcripts? How do we evaluate the quality of them? And the way we chose to do that is that for each podcast episode that we have, there is an accompanying description written by the podcast creator. And we treat these, what we've done is we've very carefully selected podcasts that have good creator descriptions. So what you can actually see here is that you have a description, and the first paragraph up here is a general description for the whole podcast show. But then what you will see in the second part of the description is that there's a specific description for this episode also. And then we obtain the topic distribution for this description, and we treat this as the true topic distribution. And then basically the evaluation metric then becomes simply a cosine similarity between the transcripts, topic distribution, and the topic distribution of the description. Yeah. So the experimental setup and how we actually tested the level that of ASR technology required, or how robust topic models actually are to these errors, is that we had 600 podcast episodes in Danish from Podimo, and we generate these baseline transcripts using dance beats on these. And then we evaluate the quality of the topic distribution, as I mentioned before, by doing a cosine similarity between the description and the baseline transcript. So here D1 is the baseline transcript and D2 is the description for the same episode. And then what we do is we slowly increase this beta value, which is our noise rate, and we inject noise into the transcript in a stochastic way. And then we calculate the similarity for increasingly corrupt transcripts. So that's what we tried to note down here. So basically you have this transcript here with beta value of 0. This is of course just a snippet of it. But then you do the similarity between the descriptions. Then we have some new one with a beta value of 0.3, and we do the similarity scoring between that and the description also. And then finally, what we also do is we also do topic distribution similarity between the baseline transcript and later corrupted transcript, just because to sort of a sanity check to see that injecting noise into the transcripts should make them diverge for the original topic distributions. So basically what you will see in our results here, so what we have on the left here is the cosine similarity scores as a function of beta and it's the cosine similarity between the descriptions and the podcast descriptions and the ASR transcripts with varying levels of noise. And then on the right here, you see the cosine similarity scores as a function of beta between the original sort of the baseline transcript and the later noisy transcripts. And that's why we started a cosine similarity of 1. But interestingly enough, so what we actually saw is that, so in the uniform random noise case, we see this very quick decline in cosine similarity as we increase the beta value. So as we get more and more noisy transcript with this kind of random noise, we very quickly see that the topic distributions are completely ruined. But what we noticed is that when we did the same thing, but with the modeled noise, which is based on the ASR system, and we even increase the rate of these, so say that every single word technically is transcribed incorrectly, but within the boundaries of the ASR technology's capabilities, we actually see that the cosine similarity does not increase very much at all. So it does increase somewhat, but not to an alarming rate. So basically, what we actually concluded on this is that ASR technology for podcast topic distributions, like obtaining transcripts to do topic distributions on, does not actually have to be, the word error rate does not have to be perfect on an average case. And when we investigated the errors we got in the transcriptions, we noticed that This is typically because the errors that is made by an ASR, the sort of the ASR system that we had at least, they have semantically typically the same meaning as the correct word, shall we, so to say. And that's why we believe that we see this these results. Finally, I also just have this at the bottom here just to highlight. We sort of split the podcasts into deciles to see. Well, actually, I can see I'm running over time, so perhaps we should just go on to questions. And if there are no questions, I can cover this also. But yeah, please let me know.
Like, do you use many models or do you use a single model?
For the topic distributions?
No, the earlier systems that ISMIR that you use for like this one. Yes.
Yeah. So this is a single system. This is like an ASR engine or model that has been created by ISMIR. So it's a combination of different models. So you have both some Web-to-Vec models going on here, and then you have some other kind of well, it's not really models, but algorithms going on in the back also. So it's like a hybrid system. And there's also in the voice activity, there's also some other things going on. So it's a connection of things. Yeah.
Yeah. Is it a stack or a ensemble?
I am not actually entirely sure. So this is ISMIR's technology. I know the sort of the overhead of it, so I know what you see here. But the deep into the boxes, each of them, I'm actually not an expert in. So I'm sorry, I'm not really able to answer that question.
Oh, thanks.
Mikkel.
Yes.
If I might. It's a great talk. I think it addresses some of the questions we all have about how usable these transcripts are for the kind of work that we're all involved in here.
Yeah.
One of the things that occurs to me is that the vocabulary models in the audiobook transcripts that you used to create the noise models might not match up with the sort of keywords that are important for the topic modeling. I'm wondering if you did any sort of feature comparisons there to see whether the vocabulary that's interesting really overlaps in the way that you're assuming.
Yeah,
I think using the books was a fantastic idea, and it's and I'm just wondering how close it comes to the actual material.
Yeah. So I think it's actually like absolutely like well, I don't know if concern, but it's an interesting thing to investigate. And actually, we did not really check how, as you say, like keywords specifically, but we did check the rate of overlap, right? At least, and in the audiobooks, I believe we have the vocabulary that comes from there. I think there is so basically there's 20% of the words, which is quite high. Well, actually, sorry, 10% of the words that occur in the podcast never occur in the audiobooks. So that's actually quite a high rate, right? So that will mean, and in those cases, what we do when we do the corrupting is that we delete the words from the transcriptions. So basically the assumption there is that when we look up in this conditional distribution, right, when we look up a word and it hasn't occurred in the, like basically it doesn't exist in the conditional distribution, then we assume that the sort of the idea is that the ASR technology would not be able to transcribe it, right? So it miss out on it completely. And that is a missing like point. So a more extensive corpus that we have made these like this conditional distributions on would absolutely help this make it better, make it more robust basically, I think. Yeah, I hope that answers the question.
It does quite well. I had an idea. Do you have access to the are you running the ASR system yourself, or was that done sort of out of bounds?
So I do have access to it, yes.
So I mean, another way to do this would be to permute the coefficients in the beam search, or to corrupt them directly there and essentially use direct noise in the recognition.
Yes, That's a very good point. Yeah, that's a really good point actually. So you could do that. I think what makes it more difficult is it makes the corruption process more of like an online thing, where here I obtained the baseline transcripts offline, right? And then they got shipped to me, the baseline transcripts, and then I corrupted them like on my own and in a stochastic way afterwards, right? But I absolutely think that's a very good point.
Great, thanks so much.
Thank you.
Rosie, I saw you have a hand raised, but if you have a quick question.
Oh, yeah, my quick question is, and you report your results are very interesting on how the distribution is not so dissimilar from the original distribution. I'm just wondering if you are planning to have already tested this in the end-to-end task that you're really interested in.
No, so in our case, so I sort of sit in between the chairs here. So ISMIR is someone I work with, and Podimo is someone I work with, and I'm employed at DTU. So it's not something they've employed currently, but part of so to put it short, ISMIR was interested in showing how their transcriptions can actually be used in a recommendation setting. And so this was sort of a preliminary research to show Podimo that they can use this for topic distributions. So whether or not they're willing to pick up on actually doing that or not, I'm not entirely sure. Well, actually, I think they're interested in it, but whether they choose to prioritize this or not, I'm not. They haven't so far, basically.
Okay, thank you.
Welcome. Thank you very much for the questions.
Great. Yeah, I think we should move on to the last presentation given the time here. And thanks, Miguel, for the great presentation. Yeah, so the last presentation will be from Elise. And I think she'll be talking about this paper about identifying introductions in podcast episodes from the automatically generated transcripts. So Elise, the stage is yours.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. My name is Elise, and I will be talking about the work that we've done here at Pandora on identifying introductions in podcast episodes from automatically generated transcripts. Sorry, yeah. So as the amount of podcast contents and podcast listenership both explodes, it becomes more important for us to help the listeners find the podcasts that they're interested in. However, as some podcast episodes can be as long as several hours, it may be difficult for users to get a sense of the content before they dive in. According to this graph, only half of the people listens to the entire podcast, while some of the people only listen to a small portion of the podcast. So it would be great if we can find a way for users to preview the content before they commit to listening. Luckily, as the automatic speech recognition technologies progress, it becomes possible for us to have large scale of automatically transcribed contents that has a usable quality, which was not possible before. And also with the advanced NLP tools, we can now perform analysis on this transcript data. So here we address the question of identifying the introductions in podcast episodes. So the introductions can be used as a preview for users to sample content. And the good thing is that we can play the original audio to give the listeners an authentic feeling of the content. And they can also be used for recommendations and the promotions on and off platform. So what is actually an introduction? In this work, we consider the introduction to be a segment of the episode that typically describes the episode's main subjects, contents, and speakers. And notably, although the introduction shares similar topics and the vocabulary with the rest of the episode, Its structural uniqueness makes it possible for listeners to recognize this. So this diagram shows one way in which the introductions can be placed in the episode. So for the episode, we may have music at the beginning, and then we may have a program introduction, which talks about the general theme of the program. And this is often similar across all episodes in the program, and this is trivial to identify. So we focus on the episode introduction, and there can be ads inserted between each of these segments. And the episode introduction is often followed by the main body of the episode. So the data for our work is ASR transcripts generated by Google's speech-to-text service. Although the data scale is large, it is very noisy. For example, on this clip on the right, all the words in red are mistranscribed words. And the transcript data also have no punctuations, sentence boundaries, etc., making them more challenging to work with. So at Pandora, we recruited a group of volunteers to annotate the introductions in these episodes manually. Using the content annotation tools that we developed, the volunteers can listen to the audio while looking at the transcript, and we ask them to mark the beginning and the end point of the introductions. In total, we have annotated 417 episodes. And because it can be tricky to decide on the position of the intro, we have 117 episodes annotated by 3 independent labelers, and we track the agreement between these labelers. We found that for the most cases, we have either a full agreement or a majority agreement, where 2 out of the 3 labelers agree on one position, and only a few episodes have no agreement. The plot on the right shows the position of the introductions in the episodes. And although in many cases, the introduction starts right at the beginning, it can also start very late, as long as 1,000 words into the episode. And from the annotations, we also noticed that different podcast programs can be structured quite differently. So for one program, we might always have the episodes beginning with music, then program intro, and then episode intro. However, the other program may always have the episode intro coming before the program intro. So so intuitively, if the model is trained on some episodes from a program, it will be much easier for it to work on the other episodes in this program. And to handle this, we created 2 different test sets. One is the episodes from the programs that the model is trained on, and the other is from the programs that the models have not seen. And our method is based on the BERT model. For each episode, we break down the transcript into multiple spans, and this is because of BERT's input length limit. And then we train the model to label each token as part of the intro or not part of the intro. Then we remerge the spans into the original episodes. And because the model creates token level predictions, we needed to use a maximum difference algorithm to identify the boundaries of the intro. And we use a baseline from Glove embeddings and logistic regression. And we further use 2 data augmentation strategies to increase the amount of training data, as our dataset is not very large. And this diagram shows our whole pipeline. So we begin by having people annotate the episodes manually. Then we break down the transcripts into spans and feed them into the transformer model. Then we remerge the spans and do the boundary selection. And these are some more details about our data augmentation techniques. So the base model is the pre-trained BERT, And the first data augmentation strategy is the random word replacement based on TF-IDF scoring. So we will replace only the relatively unimportant words. The other augmentation strategy is randomly applying token swap, deletion, or crop. And next, I will go through the results of our work. And this plot gives us a general idea of the model's performance. In these plots, each vertical line represents a token, where the dark lines are the tokens that the model considered to have a high probability of being in the intro, and the lighter lines have a lower probability. And we found that for the base BERT model as well as the data augmentation models, the models are able to identify blocks of tokens that aligns well with the ground truth, while the baseline finds high probability tokens throughout the text, and it's not able to find a consistent block. And with this general idea, we then examine the results quantitatively using two metrics. The first is accuracy. So there's a lot of information in this table. I'll try to break it down. So we show the results on the test set of seen programs at the top and the unseen programs at the bottom. We also consider the accuracy in identifying the start and end of the intro separately. Here we consider accuracy versus various offsets. So an offset of 0 means that the model is exactly correct. An offset of 1 means it's off by 1 token, and so on. And then the confidence intervals are shown in the parentheses. We found that for the test set of seen programs, the model with TF-IDF word replacement generally works the best and overperforms our baseline by over 25%. However, on the test set of unseen programs, the random augmentation model works the best, and probably because it is more resilient to the noise in the unknown data. And this also shows that the model is able to generalize towards unfamiliar data, while the baseline works really badly on the unfamiliar data. And additionally, we also evaluate our model by looking at the overlap between the predicted intro and the ground truth. On the left, this is the results on the seen programs. And here we found that the base BERT model and the BERT with TF-IDF word replacement both works pretty well. And on the right, we found that the models generally do not do as well. However, the random augmentation model still does a little better than the other models. And finally, we look at the token embeddings learned by the models to better understand how they're learning to do this prediction. So we performed a principal component analysis on the token embeddings from the output in the first layer of the BERT model, as well as the final layer, that's the 12th layer. And at the first layer, we found several clusters, mainly clustering based on semantic meanings. For example, there was a cluster of personal pronouns, and there's another cluster of verbs such as do and does. And here the intro tokens and the not intro tokens are not separated. However, at the 12th layer, we found two pretty distinct clusters of the is intro and the not intro tokens. This tells us that the model has learned this task-specific information at this layer. And so these are the main takeaways of our work. We presented a novel dataset of annotated ASR transcripts, and we hope that this dataset can facilitate future work on the structure-based segmentation of ASR transcripts. And we also show that our models are resilient to the noise in ASR data as well as the diverse structuring of the podcast episodes. And we believe that our models can be used to create podcast clips for preview and recommendations. And finally, on behalf of the other co-authors, I want to thank Chaitanya, Chen, Hacham, and Oscar for their comments on our manuscript. And we want to thank the content science team and all science people at SiriusXM Pandora. And please feel free to contact us for discussion and questions.
Great. Any questions from the audience? I mean, I can get started. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
So for like introductions, can you do some like testing where users can select the specific introductions that they want to provide, like a specific interval of the podcast, and later compare it to the model you are trained and see which one is better? Because I think, do you have done like A/B testing? Online
Sorry,
testing?
sorry, I don't think I heard you very well.
Yeah, I was talking about like for a podcast, like they if if a podcast already has introduction, like users can choose the specific time interval which they want to like, which is like in YouTube they have like segments of videos that they can users can choose from. Like, is there such a similar thing in podcast? Like there are segments.
Yeah, so my understanding is you're saying that say other contents may have a specific preview, but it's not yet available for.
Okay, we're super excited to move on to our next section, which is a panel of discussion with creators. I really hope you have enjoyed the workshop as much as we have, and let's wrap up the workshop with a really interesting and exciting discussion. We have a podcast creator panel. We have a really set of diverse type of creators. We have some great science podcast creators. We have Farsi podcast creators and everyone. We thank Ni. She is a senior user researcher from Spotify who has accepted our invitation to moderate this panel. So I would like to just give it out to Ni to start the discussion, and hope we'll learn as researchers, as engineers who have been working on podcast recommendations. Creators are really important part of this ecosystem, and it's really good to learn from them directly what is it that they care about, and how can we take that into account in our work. So Ni, please go ahead.
Thank you, Zara. Hi, everyone. My name is Ni, and like Zara said, I am working with a lot of the panel here, a lot of the organizers here at Spotify in the personalization mission. So just to start, we would just love to start a discussion with our podcast producers here on the panel. So just to check, Zara, I think right now you're the main video on our screen. Is there a way to maybe show Ali and Josh?
That's a good question. Let me see. So you see my video even though it was turned off?
Yes, so you're like the main kind of feature speaker. So if there's a way for us to feature Josh and Ali, that would be great.
If you invite them to speak, I think they may pop up.
Oh, okay, right, got it. Perfect. So hi, Josh and Ali. I know it's our first time meeting, but let's just jump into the panel. I know you're probably familiar with speaking to an audience. I'm not worried at all here. Okay, so thanks everyone for coming in today. If you would like, feel free to put in your questions in the chat throughout our discussion, and I will have a certain pause within our discussion for our panel here to take questions. Wendy and Patrick couldn't make the time with us today, but they have graciously agreed to have a brief panel interview that I will also show everyone later. And we'll hope to get Ali and Josh kind of thoughts and reactions on that, and as well as share their own answers. All righty. Okay, so to kick things off, Ali and Josh, could you please introduce yourselves and share what your role is within the podcast space? How about we start with Ali?
Yeah, sure. Hey. Name is Ali Bandari. I've been hosting podcasts partially started from 2015, and been going on. One is called Channel B, the other one B Plus. So in both of them, essentially what I do is that I talk about what I read, watched recently.
I'm so sorry to interrupt you. I think your sound is a bit muffled. Is it just me, or does everyone also?
Yeah, I also can't hear Ali well.
Yes.
Maybe we can start with Josh and see what I do.
Sure. Yeah. Josh, would you mind introduce yourselves and just share with us what your role is within the podcast space?
Certainly. So, hi everybody. My name is Josh Richmond. I'm a producer for Stitcher, and specifically for their comedy network Earwolf. I've been there about 6.5 years. Produced a lot of different shows. You may know shows like Unspooled, Freedom, Raised by TV. I've worked on shows like Hello from the Magic Tavern, How Did This Get Made in some capacity. Currently doing some work on Seth Rogen's upcoming show called Storytime with Seth Rogen. I do a lot of work in particular on a Stitcher Premium and paywalled content, which has become a little bit of a specialty for me. But I'm a little bit of a jack of all trades around Earwolf.
That's awesome. Thank you for sharing that. So I can't help but ask, it sounds like you work on both podcasts and TV show. Is there any key difference between the two media that you want to share with us?
Or sorry. I didn't mean to give the impression I work on a TV show.
No. Sorry.
Yeah, it's I'm an audio only guy. Specifically, everything I used to work actually at SiriusXM on the radio, on talk radio back before they bought Stitcher. So it's a little bit of a full circle for me. But yeah, I've been in the audio space exclusively for the last 15 years or so.
Awesome. So actually, you know what's funny? I'm a user researcher. So when we decided to change the term podcast to show in Spotify, many of our users also got, because we also have video podcasts now. So the line between podcast, audio and video and everything has been very blurred now. So I'm feeling that first-hand experience as our user right now.
It's absolutely getting blurrier by the day. What is video, what is audio, especially as more podcasters are incorporating video.
Right. Yeah. And especially with big names like Seth Rogen stepping into the audio space. So is there any interesting difference when you kind of transition from the radio format within Sirius FM into the podcast? I guess it's more like time delay on demand type of audio.
Oh, definitely. I mean, the most obvious is the fact that you're crafting something, in your own private space and then working on it in post, as opposed to something that's really going on the air directly, which the emergence of things like Clubhouse and Green Room are kind of an interesting tote back to the live radio world I came from, and it's very cool to see things like that taking off. Another major difference is that radio, there are some indicators of ratings. There are still some classic measures like Arbitron that I'm not sure if Sirius still uses for their main shows, but definitely did. And you can kind of track things indirectly seeing how things are doing on social media. But there is definitely less of a focus on metrics compared to podcasting, where you really can track your downloads in a lot of discrete detail.
That's a great point. Awesome. Ali, do you think we can try again?
I don't know. You tell me. Do I sound better now?
Yes, so much better. Thank you so much for
good.
helping us figure that
No
out.
worries.
Yeah, please go ahead and introduce yourself.
So maybe I should restart then. So I've been creating and hosting 2 podcasts in Farsi, started from 2015. Both of them, at the core of them, they're pretty much the same. I read or listen to or watch something, and then I retell that story to my audience the way I would tell it at a dinner party, sort of. When you have time and you're sitting down and you're relaxed and you have like an hour and a half, I have that of hopefully undistracted attention of yours. And then I can tell you that story patiently. So the first podcast, the Channel B, was mostly like nonfiction writing of all different sorts, from essays and to profiles, but mostly more and more I get into like true crime, and both it appealed more to audience, and then I grow an interest in that all of a sudden, and so it became more a true crime-ish show. And the second one, B Plus, was from the beginning dedicated to me summarizing and maybe also like giving my angle to every nonfiction book that I read, and I feel like I'd like to share this with my friends. So that's my way of doing that. So I read the book, I take my notes, and then I give you the gist of the book, the summary of the book, actions that could help me. And those are like different types of book too. So it's from personal development all the way to history and pretty much everything in between. So I started with that the Channel B 2015, B Plus 2017, and they're both going on.
Awesome. That's super interesting about like I think your pitch is retelling stories as if you're at a dinner party. And I feel like at dinner party, people definitely kind of share their opinions as well. And it's not just like summarizing, right? Do you do that as well? And kind of in what way do you share your opinions, not knowing exactly who's listening compared to when you were at a dinner party?
Very good point. In a very controlled way, I do. First of all, I'm like very upfront that, okay, so far what I've said was writer's opinion. This is my take on it. And I repeat that like in the beginning and at the end, okay, this piece that I just said, this was my opinion and my opinion only. And every time I do that, of course, there is some backlash. And then that's something you need to learn how to cope with. But that's part of the deal.
Super interesting. So Zara told me that you are both a host and a producer for both of your show. And I think Josh mentioned like some really interesting aspect of producing, meaning you have to track your metrics, kind of see a lot of these things that you can see firsthand that you couldn't see on the radio before. Are you engaged in that process of producing too? Or which part of, besides, hosting your own show, which part of the production are you most involved in?
So in the production itself, it's practically I do the writing myself. So the content, the material, I write it myself. In one of the shows. In the second show, no, I have a co-author with me, helping summarizing the books. But also I'm the one diving, not that deep to be honest, but diving the deepest, at least amongst our team, into the statistics and analytics of the podcast, to the extent that it's provided by podcast hosting platforms, which is not really that deep anyway. If you compare it with what you get from Google Analytics, for example, or what you get from YouTube, for instance, what you get from podcast, it's like pretty old. It's like pretty superficial too.
That's a super relevant point, and I'm definitely biased here because I work on insights at Spotify, even though not on the creator side. I'm just so curious, and Josh, I would like to ask you the same question. Which part of analytics do you feel like you need the most that the platforms are not providing to you?
Yeah, I mean, it is. It's really true that the state of podcast metrics currently are compared to what you can see for, I think, YouTube or a lot of other systems are not nearly as in depth. Really, the most useful to me as a producer is just sort of seeing, you know, how episodes perform in contrast to each other. And I imagine that there's ways you could go. You know, I know that Apple's introduced some tools that, like, you can, for instance, see where people are dropping off during an episode, which can be useful, but honestly, in day to day, I don't find myself missing much, and maybe it's just because my imagination hasn't been open yet to like what analytics could really be there. But a lot of the work I do is kind of that episode level data is usually good enough to sort of see what topics are resonating with audiences, what guests seem like they're bringing in the biggest audiences. That's the most important stuff to me.
Mm-hmm. What about you, Ali?
No, I agree, actually. I agree with Josh. Even though it's not that deep, I don't mind it not being that deep neither. I've started with YouTube, experiencing with YouTube a few months from January, actually. So it's been a few months now. Mm-hmm. And obviously I get a lot of analytics there, and I mean there is no limit. There you can actually dive in and not come up for like 2-3 days, just to study YouTube analytics forever. And there is, of course, there is the deeper you dive, the more you learn there. But there is a limit to how useful it is actually. Mm-hmm. And how much, as a creator, how much do you really want to know? So because there is some point there too, like you said, all right, I don't really, above everything, and first of all, I'm creating this show to enjoy it. Mm-hmm. If you tell me a bit too much on how every specific target group of my audiences are behaving and reacting, the retention of this segment of the show, and that may be a bit too much. I don't know. So that's something. I say it's not deep, but I don't mind it actually.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I really agree with that, and I think for creators, I think it can be a really big mistake to try to optimize your content too much toward what is hitting those metrics. Like it's really important to have a voice and be chasing the topics you're passionate about, and audiences will follow you there more than saying like, oh, how can we hit whatever X trending topic is or whatever. That's a route to just make whatever you're doing just less interesting, more generic.
And less authentic too.
Yeah, that's a great point. Since we just talking about audience, I did have a question that I wanted to ask you from the beginning, which is, it sounds like having an authentic voice, having your own point of view, while being mindful of, you know, what tracks with a popular audience. How else do you grow your audience besides, you know, like developing that distinguished, unique voice for yourself?
Yeah, I can go first on that one. So for us, when I started in 2015, there were less, obviously, I think not more than 5-6 podcasts in Farsi anyway. So there was nobody there, practically speaking. And if you listen to the podcast from episode 1, still we do that. But the earliest episodes, I'm repeating it like in the intro, in the outro. Guys, this is the Podcatcher app. That's why it's good to listen to podcasts on these applications as opposed to like downloading the MP3 file. So I'm doing podcast 101 to my listeners in 2015. And I had to do, we still have to do that to some extent. But so growing was, so this had its own costs too, but it wasn't without benefits neither, because a lot of good stuff that people attribute to podcasts, I ended up taking credits for those too. Okay, this channel B is a good thing because you can listen to it while you're driving. Well, that's not specific for channel B, but people didn't know any other podcast anyway. So that ended up that helped us to some extent too. But that was so the growth was purely organic. We still haven't come to the point that we feel like we need to
invest or spend on paid advertisement. We are still growing organic to some extent. I say to some extent because we are being like active on social media. On Instagram, we are super active there. We are somewhat active on Twitter. And we are hyperactive on our website as well, getting a lot of search traffic, and then converting them to audience. So this is like an indirect journey, not that cost beneficial, but not that bad. It is performing quite okay for us. And honestly, we don't really have that many other options given all the limitations we have. But so far, so to long story short, no paid advertisement so far for us, only organic. But then we gear that up with being highly active on Instagram and on our websites.
Yeah. So, I mean, the issue of discovery is really that, and like getting the audiences to find new shows when at a network where we're launching a lot of new shows is really like the question. And probably the hottest take I'll have on a panel that is about podcast recommendations is that in a lot of ways, especially for the kind of shows Earwolf makes, discovery is more of a problem for creators than it is for listeners, in the sense that I think the average podcast listener has a rotation that's pretty set when it comes to things like, 52 episode a week chat shows. If you're a fan of seasonal shows, serial style shows, that might be one thing. And especially if you're a new podcast listener, I think podcast recommendations make a really big difference. But for the average podcast fan, you kind of have your rotation. I know I have my rotation of like, these are like the handful of shows I check out every week, and it's a really high bar for something new to crack it. And it's a really high bar for anything that we create, even amongst like fans of the stuff we already make, to crack into somebody's regular listening. So I still find that the best path we have to growth is those really organic outlets. Obviously, Earwolf and Stitcher, we do things like paid advertising and a lot of those traditional tactics, but hosts asking listeners to recommend their shows, and tell their friends, and especially having guests on or guesting at other shows. These are still, I think, the very best route to bringing in a new audience is bringing like an individual person's audience into your show by inviting them as a guest, or kind of having that exchange and feeling like there's communities merging, because being able to build that community in an organic way and something that feels like a word of mouth kind of buzzy way is still the strongest route possible to having an audience that's actually gonna want to have it break into the rotation and have it stick week after week. We haven't found anything better yet at Earwolf, I think, at least.
Gotcha. So it sounds like both of you converge on the idea that organic growth seems to be the best path for you. But we also talked about metrics before, right? So what do you use those metrics for, if not for audience growth? Or maybe you do, and that's kind of like a facilitator for organic growth. I would just love to hear more about how you use like metrics and audience growth.
Absolutely. So I mean, I'll take it first on this one, just because we definitely have we pay pretty close attention to our metrics, and certainly, obviously, they're really important for things like tracking revenue and all of that. But in terms of trying to measure growth, we run marketing campaigns on a semi-regular basis. We'll do things like paid spend or attempt to drop clips of episodes into other podcast feeds, or do similar methods like this. Once again, kind of depending on that even in a feed drop, you're kind of depending on that host recommendation aspect. But then we use those metrics afterwards to sort of see how did each of these individual campaigns perform. I know that's really useful to our marketing team. As a producer myself, it's most useful just in terms of like seeing what types of content are hitting with audiences. which is like I work on Unspooled, which is a movie show, which is probably the easiest example, because each episode covers a different movie, so we can take a look and say, hey, we're covering big blockbusters this month, and it brings in X audiences, and now we're doing something that's more like cult films or foreign films, and maybe that's going to bring in how much. We predict it'll bring in probably a smaller audience because there's less name recognition, but how much less audience is it going to bring in? We could test these things. And again, we don't want to optimize too much for that, because a huge part of the voice of that show is like, we're not just going to cover Marvel movies. We're trying to have a really interesting, diverse palette of shows, but finding out how far we could go in that direction without really losing our core audience, that should be really, really useful for that.
Awesome. Thank you. Ali, what about you?
Yeah, what I can add to that is the metric we get from this Apple Podcast Connect, the beta version of that from Apple, which is retention, and it's not I think as far as I know, this is only like representing listeners who are listening through this podcast application on iOS, so it's pretty limited. But you can assume with some. You can assume that this is representative of your audience to some extent. And that could help us. Okay, this is the point people actually leaving the podcast. And if the drop is like larger than something, then we can learn some serious lessons there. Okay, this is what we did there. That's wrong. That doesn't resonate well. So it's mostly like, if things go really wrong, we can read it from the statistics. And also the other thing for our generally for our statistics, it doesn't really fluctuate much. It's been a continuous growth from 2015 till now. So like for us, you can't really learn much from that. You can like, okay, I'm growing faster and I'm growing slower. But beyond that, there isn't really much more that I can expect from my statistics. I can see, okay, this is the platform they listen to. This is like this is sort of the demography. This is the application they use. That could change from year to year. But apart from that, not really much. But this retention, I think that what Apple calls it is consumption rate, something along those lines. That helps me. That is where I say, all right, okay, this placing the ads there was not a wise choice, probably. People are actually dropping there and not coming back. Or this intro was smart because it is engaging the audience from the very beginning. So nobody is leaving. Very few are leaving the show. All right, that's good. So this kind of like learning, that's what I get from Podcast Connect.
Gotcha.
I hope I'm saying the name right. It is Podcast Connect, isn't it? Yes.
I think that's right. Yeah.
Yeah, I think
so. So with regards to audience, without being able to see your metrics, I assume that you have a very diverse audience in terms of taste, but also markets and culture, that kind of stuff, especially for you, Ali. Like I think Zara told me that you are the biggest podcast in Farsi. So do you encounter any sort of challenges when you have such a diverse audience? Maybe, in terms of maybe they're bilingual, they speak both English and Farsi or English and other languages. They come from different walks of life. I know at least for us, Spotify, we focus a lot on the US in the past few years, but we also know that, podcasts, maybe not called so, just another form of audio storytelling is growing internationally too. So have you felt that, or have you had to deal with that kind of challenge? What can you share with us about that?
Yeah, it is a challenge. I mean, creating content in any language other than English, and also with any alphabet other than that's difficult because many of the systems don't work that well. Like the hashtag system doesn't work that well with any language other than English. And we can use tags on English tags on our post, but then they could look like this. The content is not English. You're using English tags. Maybe you're doing something fishy there. So that itself becomes, all right, do I really have to do that? How do I really get myself into like Explorer, for instance, without using the hashtags? And if I use the hashtag, that could be turned. So that's a challenge. But as I said, creating content in Farsi, it hasn't been really easy. Discovery is a challenge anyway. But what I'd like to see is, all right, if somebody is consuming any Farsi content on this platform, would it be possible for this platform to offer them more of Farsi content? And when I say content, it doesn't necessarily have to be podcast. They're listening to Farsi music. Could the platform offer them Farsi music? They are reading a Farsi book. They are like browsing Farsi websites. Could they be exposed to, could my content, could podcast content, Farsi podcast content be like brought in before them as well? Because without those helps, it's tough. They are like our audience, they are like all over the world. So based on their region, they are getting recommendations. I'm in Netherlands. I listen to Farsi podcasts. None of my recommended podcasts in my feed are Farsi. Everything is in Dutch. I'm in Norway. Everything is in Norwegian, because it's based on my region. Depends on the application you're using, obviously, but this is not really that well developed, I feel like.
Yeah, that's really fascinating from Ollie. And the only thing I'll add to it is, I mean, Earwolf shows certainly mostly focus, as Stitcher shows generally mostly focus on the American audience and the English speaking audience, but we do see that like shows around the world in different languages are growing, and we have tried to tap into that. I know we worked on a show, we're producing a show called Spanish Aki Presents that was specifically a group of bilingual comedians who spoke both Spanish and English, and we're planning on producing some of their episodes in Spanish, and was a really amazing, a really terrific show, but a show that even when we were experimenting with things like releasing full episodes in Spanish or trying to find that Spanish speaking audience, it was just really difficult to connect with them. We had a really hard time finding that audience, which we know exists and would love the content, but I think would have a hard time searching for us.
This is a great point. I want to just remind the audience, especially those who just joined, that you can put your questions in the chat and I'll make sure to read them when we take pauses between topics. But I just want to say that both of you, I feel like you have done your user research very well, because these are things that we have heard from our users as well. You know, the discovering contents and language that they're familiar with is hard. Or even, you know, Josh, like you said earlier, like people have a rotation of podcasts and they're very limited in time to be able to squeeze in another one. So podcast discovery it's hard for the user to, and especially for creators, because it's a very competitive, crowded space. Okay, so yes, please, audience, please feel free to put in your questions. And next topic, since we were talking about discovery, language is an obvious issue. Finding audience in a new language or maybe new culture is an issue. So it seems like as a platform, people who work on platforms should think about these more. Is there anything else that you think could help, maybe in terms of data or any kind of process with creators that platforms can work on to help potential listeners find your specific podcast?
I'll share a couple of ideas that have come to mind, which is things that we've experimented with, even like within like our own specific Earwolf site, but I'd love to see implemented in a bigger way in a dream world. One of them is being able to search by guest or by talent, which is you know, a huge, again, like I emphasized earlier, a huge way that people discover our shows or that our audience finds new shows is from hosts of that show guesting at other people's shows and vice versa, and the way that talent is sort of shared between episodes. And so if I say if I'm a big fan of the comedian Paul F. Tompkins and I want to find out every episode of a show Paul has been on, as a way to, because that's often a great entry point into new shows, is if Paul's on an episode, it's probably going to be a good episode. The ability to search for talent, to see both the shows he's hosted and the shows he's guested on, would be a really terrific route for discovery that I think a lot of we have that ability on our website to search by guest, but being able to implement that in an app would be huge. Another idea I've talked about, just, and maybe it's because I come from the radio world, and I think it's an amazing tool that sort of just helps cut down on just the decision fatigue of being confronted with so many different possible shows, is having some kind of good like one button option if you're a fan of like a genre or a network. Say if you're a comedy fan, or even if you are a fan of Earwolf shows, but you're like, I don't know which show from this network I want to put on. I can't think about it. I have to start my commute in the next 2 minutes and I have no time to figure this out. I'm just gonna hit like the Earwolf radio station or press play on the Earwolf channel, and it will immediately float like something that I know is going to be from that world, and as a possible tool for discovery, where I don't have to investigate too hard or think too hard. I can press play and I know I'll get something I kind of like, which doubles for creators as a tool for, I think, discovery for fans of that audience.
Yeah. What about you, Ali?
Yeah, that would just one thing to add to what Josh just said. That would just make it more difficult for indie podcasters to get audience if audience have the chance to play all the shows from Airwolf. Let's say that it's all bundled.
Probably true. It is. I mean, but also options of things like it could be something like a comedy channel or even like an independent shows channel, a way to say like, if you like this style, or if you want to hear what's up and coming, you can press play and you can hear something that's cool. Maybe something that's even been selected by like I think having something that like old DJs on radio shows that would float records used to, like the role they used to play of tastemaker, somebody who could be like, I'm hearing the hot new shows that are coming up. This is something that I think if you're a fan of this show, you're really going to love this. But having that kind of human recommendation of like, hey, check this new thing out would be really huge.
No, I absolutely agree with that. And I think in general, we as producers of podcasts, we are not really feeding the system with that much of metadata for each single episode. So there is some metadata on the show itself, some general description. There is the show notes too, which apps, some of them use them, some of them don't use them at all. But for the single episodes, because going back to what Josh just said, if you're after some inspiration for a dinner recipe, and you're after like a 20-minute long podcast on cooking, vegetarian, you should be able to somehow search for it. Not really narrow down that much, but still I would like to see that option that as a creator, when I'm uploading an episode, I'll tell a bit more about that episode. Some more metadata would be helpful down the line anyway. But we are not doing really that much of that. It's just upload the file, a very general description, and that's it. So obviously it won't be searchable. There is no metadata to go back to, and that's something I honestly expect that to come anytime soon, like sooner or later. But that would help a lot, because then it actually can help us. That is the kind of data that I can take a good look at and realize, okay, this is the category of content that my audience is relating to most. That could help me. But the way it is now, I can't really get that much from it.
So sound like more metadata that producers can provide to the platform, especially, like Josh said, like guests or talents by episodes, just making an easy entry point for people, but many more like topics or any kind of features of the episodes that you think would be relevant should be used by the platform.
Exactly. Like, to give you an example, the platform I was hosting my podcast on for 3 years, on the show metadata, the Farsi language was not one of the options. So I couldn't even tell the platform that this content is in Farsi. So you can imagine how hard it will be for audience to discover. It's practically undiscoverable.
Right. Yeah.
But now Farsi is there, but still, like, it's at show level. It's not at episode level that we're communicating that information. That what is this episode actually about? Who is this good for?
Awesome. So we do have like a set of questions, like I said, that we asked the folks who couldn't be here. So I'll just convey to you all what the questions are, so you can contextualize the answers. So first, we'll just switch gears a little bit to see the answers, and then we'll come back to this live discussion panel. And I'll try to save maybe like 10-15 minutes at the end. So if anyone in the audience, if you want to just turn on your microphone or video to ask the panel questions directly as if we were there in person, please feel free to do so. But of course, if you feel more inclined to put in the chat, please also do so. Okay, so this is the question that we asked the other podcast producers and hosts. What are you? So we asked. This is a structure I actually usually use for my user research studies. So it was interesting to see from the creative side what you share. But we asked about their fears, hopes, and dreams. So fears, what are you worried about within the podcast recommendation system space? What do you fear might happen that's good for you, your audience? That's not good, not good for you, your audience, or the podcast world in general. And hopes here center around what you hope will happen, like it's more feasible in the near term that will benefit you or your audience. And dreams is, if you have a magic wand, what would you like to make happen in the podcast recommendation systems? And it's just in general in the podcast world. And this is regardless of feasibility. So first, let me try to share my screen. Just one moment. So we will first hear from Wendy. So Wendy is a radio reporter and journalist, and created the Gimlet podcast Science Versus. And please let me know if you can hear the video and see it okay. All right, let's try to refresh route.
We see them.
We can't hear.
Oh, you can't see it?
I can see it, but I can't hear it.
Try downloading the video.
I'm sorry, what did you say?
You can download the video and play it locally.
Oh, I see.
I think it might have to do something with your voice coming from which tab.
I see. Would it be easier for you to share it maybe?
I'll try. Let's see if that makes a difference.
Yeah. Okay, so maybe while we wait for Zara to do that, we can go ahead and just talk to our live panel here. So Josh and Ellie, whoever want to start first, what are your fears that you can share with us about podcast recommendation systems that you've had experience with so far, or in the future also? like what might happen that's not good for you or for your audience?
Yeah. I mean, to me, the big obvious fear here is just the idea of a couple of like, I mean, that when people are searching for these
So I
shows,
think my
I think that's working.
Awesome. Okay, so maybe Zara, we can wait for Josh to finish and then we can play Wendy.
Yes, just wanted to try that it works. Josh, please go ahead.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, the big obvious fear for me here is just the idea that when people are searching for recommendations, that there may be a handful of big shows that are crowding out the long tail of mid-tier and indie shows. You know, obviously, I think right now, I forget what the statistic is, but I think it is something like, I don't know, 1% of podcasts get more than like 30,000 downloads an episode. I don't think that exact math is right, but it's something like that, where like even like the mid-tier podcasts are barely breaking like the 1% of like all of the podcasts that are out there. And already I think recommendation is highly geared towards like the big hits. But I worry about a situation where like, and some of this, you know, honestly, you can put on the shoulders of big networks like Stitcher, where we're creating huge shows of like celebrities and which are obviously flashy and easy to recommend because they're from talent people know. But I do worry about you know, big celebrity names crowding out like both existing mid-tier shows and the ability of any new shows to gain traction.
Oops, sorry, I just realized I muted myself. So I was saying that Josh, this theme, I think really resonated with the other podcast hosts too, in terms of recommendation system being biased towards big hits and crowding out a long tail. And actually, at least for Spotify, I know that it's a problem that we want to solve for creators. But yeah, let's hear what Wendy has to say, because I think you might find it resonating.
Oh, let me start again. Okay, so I think my biggest fears around recommender systems is that our show gets left behind, so that Science Versus doesn't get recommended to audiences that I think would like it, and that similar sort of science shows instead get recommended. That would kind of be the worst thing that could happen. In terms of my hopes, on the flip side, my hopes is that our show does get recommended to audiences who like it. But more than that, and a little more nuanced, would be that we're not only getting recommended to people that listen to similar science shows, so people listening to, say, Ologies or Every Little Thing or something like that, where a lot of those audiences might have already heard of Science Versus. But, you know, my hope is that we would be reaching out to people who might not have heard us, sort of shows that are like a little bit adjacent but kind of feel similar. A show like You're Wrong About, for example, so that it's really trying to elevate Science Versus and kind of grow the show, basically.
Oh, it sounds like it's it has paused.
So you stopped listening. So no, it was not paused. Okay, I think maybe my connection is not very good, but let me continue.
Yeah,
you guys know this as experts in the space. I think what sometimes I see, and this is more of a user experience rather than as a creator, is that sometimes I get recommended shows that I not only don't want to listen to, but despise. And then I feel weirdly emotional about it. I'm like, how dare you think I would like this trash? And so my dream would be that that never happens. Obviously, recommending Science Versus to everyone would never elicit that response. But my dream would be that a recommender system could get inside people's heads, not literally, and basically give them something that they didn't even know they wanted, which I think Science Versus kind of fits into, because a lot of people think they don't like science. And then they listen to the show and will say, oh, this was really fun, and I learned a lot of really great things. So if a recommender system could somehow know who those audiences were who think they don't like science but want to know the facts, and then would recommend the show to them, that would be my dream.
That was Wendy's whenever you want, I can play Patrick's as well. Let me know, Ni, what do you think we continue.
Thanks. I think we can like switch back to our live panel for a bit before we play Patrick. Maybe Patrick can be our bookend. But yeah, so Josh, as I said, like it seems like Wendy shared the same fears, and the hopes and dreams piece very closely related to kind of like the idea of recommending the right show to the right people. What about you, Ali? What are your fears, hopes, and dreams? And Josh, I have not forgotten. I know you haven't shared your hopes and dreams yet, so let's get back to that too. But I want Ali to get a chance to share his fears first.
Yeah, interestingly, I think mine is a bit different. Again, had you asked me this question maybe a year back, I would have said, well, there is no fear. Whatever comes is good because I have my audience, and on top of that, you're going to help me get some more. So what could go wrong there? But now I've been working with YouTube for 9-10 months, and there's a lot of things that can go wrong there, believe me, because on YouTube, you are getting, it depends on your channel, obviously, and a lot of other things, but we are getting more than 70%, 80, sometimes more than 85% of our viewership from YouTube recommendation. And that's good to some extent, because you say, well, I got this many viewers, and then YouTube helped me get this much more. So good, all good, right? No, it's not, because you're highly dependent on YouTube to recommend your content to the others. So you are not in charge, actually. You have to study those algorithms. Mm-hmm. You have to learn what you need to do for YouTube to recommend you to others. And it's pretty quickly becomes an obsession, because those are the numbers you're working against. You are, because whatever you do, you're not responsible for more, you're not directly responsible for more than 15-20% of your audience anyway. The majority of them, YouTube is giving you that audience with their recommendation system, obviously the second largest search engine in the world, right? So they are giving you those audience. So you have to, in a way, you have to start working for that algorithm. So you do whatever it takes for YouTube to recommend you to others. And that may not necessarily be the very thing that you started the channel to do. Your core audience value most in your content. And it becomes, this is heavy. This is a demanding job then, trying to satisfy that algorithm, because this is, and to me, it was new. Probably like many people, maybe many in the audience here, they know this already, but I haven't worked with anything like recommendation based before. And now I realize, okay, there is something to fear here, because if this recommendation system starts working and starts working well, it means that it's going to get my show in front of new audience. Then I get addicted to that. Then I need to satisfy that algorithm. And then, okay, this is not the same thing as creating content for people who love my content. It could be totally different. So I do have big fears there, actually, even though I know it could help me. Discoverability, obviously, as I explained earlier. Again, what I would like to see is my show, any podcast, Farsi podcast, brought in front of anybody who's consuming Farsi content, listening to Farsi music. All right, now it's commute time. Maybe it's time for some Farsi podcasts. You're going for a run. All right, maybe it's time for some Farsi podcasts. Farsi, because you have Farsi on your phone, on your setting, whatever. Maybe. So of course, I would like to see that. But then I've had this experience with YouTube, so I'm a bit fearful there too, to be honest.
So Rosie asked you a question in the chat, which is, what do you see the algorithm encouraging you to do that makes you, like fear the addiction?
On YouTube?
Yeah.
So of course, obviously, so you have these metrics that you're working towards. There is the click-through rate, there is the retention, So how do you increase your click-through rates? Because obviously your performance in the first 24 hours, that's going to set the stage for your performance in the first week. And that is going to pave the way for your performance down the line. CTR, you keep you keep an eye on that. How does that work? And what is your CPU? What contributes in the performance, your click-through rate? It's your title and it's your thumbnail. So these two, they don't have anything to do with the content of your video, right? The thumbnail is something different. But you have to learn what kind of thumbnail appeals to the type of audience you need to get, or you're targeting. If I compare it just here, if I compare this with podcasts, I don't care about my thumbnail, my what do you call it, cover art, my poster, episode poster. You don't really need to have that for every single episode. Some do, some don't. Some podcatchers show that. Some podcatchers even don't show that. But it's not a significant part of my production workflow, because it doesn't really affect my show much. It's an artistic work. I would like it to look good, but it doesn't really drive anything. But on YouTube, it does. So that's something. It's not, it differs, right? So it's a different thing to make a good thumbnail. To make a good title for your video is a different thing. It's a different skill. It requires a different skill set. So you need to add a new skill set to your toolbox, which has nothing to do with creating good video. Creating with good video requires good content, good videography, good storytelling, all that. Creating a good title, that's not part of that job, but it now is. For podcasts, giving it a good episode title, yeah, to some extent, but not really. You have your subscribers, you have earned it already. You did the work, you have convinced me. Now I'm a subscriber to your show. So every time you drop an episode, I'll get it. I'll see it in my feed. You don't need to hustle more. It's already there. You've done your work. Now you can sit back and produce your content, and I'll enjoy it. In YouTube, there is no guarantee. You have done your work. I have subscribed and I've clicked the bell. Still, there is no guarantee that when you drop your next episode or next video, I'll even see it on my home screen. There is no guarantee there. A lot of other things need to work for me to be able to see your content on my home screen. So that's that's scary, actually. So the recommendation system, if I start imagining, okay, the same thing that's going to happen to podcast, that I need to learn a lot of other things that has nothing to do with creating podcast, creating content. I need to learn those, and those are going to affect my listenership. It's not enough to get somebody to subscribe to the podcast, but on top of that, I need to, with every single episode, I need to go and convince them. I need to sell it to them every single time. Sell it to YouTube first, sell it to the algorithm first, and then sell it to them. That's a totally different game compared to what we have been playing so far in podcast.
It's a really well taken point, and thank you for articulating that, because I think it is something I hadn't thought of much before. But I mean, it's almost a benefit of kind of a little bit of the lo-fi nature of podcasting is that you subscribe to a feed, you know exactly what you're getting in that feed. You see all of the content. You compare it to something like, I know this is something that had happened to Facebook, for example, Facebook groups in the news feed, where they all of a sudden started finding that posts that used to show up all the time now only show up if it's hitting whatever the news feed algorithm is, because the algorithm's controlling the flow of all content. And so the focus turns into how do you game the algorithm, which does definitely really work that content. It is that's for sure a concern if we go too far down that algorithmic pushing road.
Has any of you, this is a question that comes from the chat too, has any of you feel like you've been pushed to not just think about other skill sets, right? Or maybe like polish your production when podcast is meant to be a lo-fi medium. But have you been kind of encouraged or pushed to change your content in any way? I know that was a fear that we just articulated, but also a concern, not a concern, but something that we discussed earlier in the panel, where you feel like you want to maintain your creative voice to meet the expectations of your fan, but also, you know, to ensure that you go on a journey that as creators and producers you intended on. But have you found yourself in situations where you had to change?
Yeah, I mean, echoing this entire line of discussion, we do that a little bit in a low level, just with the data that we have. You know, certainly, I'll use that movie show again as an example that over time we have, in the effort to gain the widest audience possible, move towards more recognizable films to cover, and maybe a little bit further away from things that would be really interesting to like an audience of core film fans, but not as likely to pull in the casual fans where we really want to get our numbers up. But I think I feel lucky now that like we haven't had to do a lot of that, and I can see that there's in a world where that is similar to like YouTube recommendations, where you could go so much farther down that road, where you're really just trying to like perfectly optimize that title, and like figure out exactly how to sort of game the system, which ends up with just like I think really cookie cutter content that doesn't please audiences or creators.
Mm-hmm. Ali?
No, I can say a little things on that too, because first of all, I think if that happens, it has a more like implicit nature to it. So I may easily come out and say, no, that has never happened to me. But that process, it's such an internal process sometimes that even if it happens, you may not even notice it. You don't know why you decided to work on this subject and not the other one. You may perfectly articulate that, no, this was based on this and that is the reasoning, while in fact, this is driven by some other factors. But personally speaking, that's one of the beauties of like working totally independently. No network, no boss, nobody. So we get to decide what we work on purely based on our interest. And even the B+ podcast that we're like picking books, it's very hard to describe the category of books we are covering there, because there is no single or even 3, 4, 5 category of books that you can find that could define like blanket, these are the types of book we work with. No, it's basically nonfiction. Whatever nonfictions that I read and I feel like talking about it, I will talk about it. So no, the short answer is no, but the bit longer answer is that it may have happened, but it's such an implicit process that I wouldn't have probably noticed it anyway.
So I've been reminded by the organizers that we are at time. Thank you both so much for joining the live panel. I know there are a few more questions, and I think the organizers will help facilitate maybe getting those questions to you all, and you can decide, how to answer them. But for myself, thank you so much for sharing your time with us. And this has been really fascinating. And as someone who comes from Spotify, but also hopefully this is helpful for other platforms, I hope that, we can continuously make improvements to our platform to help you find the right audience and promote in a way that protect and elevate your voice rather than making you change in a way that you don't want to. And just to end the panel, we would love to play, Zara, you can start sharing your screen if you'd like to play maybe a couple of answers on the fears and hopes piece that Patrick shared with us, just to wrap up the panel. But again, thank you both so much, and hope you have I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you very much for having me.
Of course.
Thanks a lot. This was very nice and insightful.
Okay, due to some time crunch, we're gonna play some parts of Patrick's interview, specifically just to recommend to introduce Patrick. He is an editor, reporter, and creator of Subtitle and a few other shows. I'm gonna play some parts of this interview.
Well, I mean, just thinking about.
Could you hear that? Did you hear
yes.
anything? Okay.
Yes, I heard it.
podcast, which is, I mean, it's sort of a niche podcast, which is what podcasts generally are. It's about language and people who speak them. And there's a very, very loyal core audience. And we obviously want to build on that. And if we can only do that if we have the help of recommendations, whether they're algorithmic or, you know, just from people, other listeners or what have you. And the fear that I and, you know, all independent podcast producers have is that we will kind of get squeezed out, that you know, in one way or another, the same recommendations that you see again and again of the big podcasts will just become even more consolidated, which I don't think is helpful to anyone, really. It's not helpful to me as a listener. From recommendations, I always want to see new things pop up so I can try a new podcast. And just kind of that, my fear would be that the algorithm just, you know, just is biased towards those larger shows that we all know about.
You mentioned a niche audience. What do you know about your audience, and what should we know about your audience?
Well, we know quite a few things about our audience just through surveying over the years, a couple of different surveys that we've done, also from our podcast publisher gives us various metrics. We know about things like completion rate, how from Apple, meaning how far into a podcast somebody has listened, which is incredibly useful. And that's actually what makes me say that we have a very loyal audience, because our completion rate is strong. We also know from emails, Twitter, what have you, but we would love to know more. And if the algorithm can help us know more, that would be great.
That brings me to hopes. What do you hope will happen in podcast recommendation systems in the near future that will benefit you or your audience?
Well, I'm really hoping that these recommendations, that these automated recommendations will be biased somewhat in favor of independent podcasts, because those are really what has driven the industry to being what it is today. All of those hit podcasts, you know, many of them started off as independents, and certainly the podcasters did. And, you know, tomorrow's hits are independents today. So I really hope that there's, you know, there will be a real bias towards sort of discoverability of smaller podcasts that are, you know, I'm not talking about like two guys in a basement talking about hockey or something like that. I'm talking about, you know, quality podcasts. And I should also add internationally, I think here in the United States, the recommendations are kind of a little too narrow in favor of American podcasts. There's a whole world out there. So for that reason, you know, for all of those, I hope that the recommendations are as broad as they possibly can be.
Okay, Chingwei, do you want to take it to wrap up the workshop? Or maybe I can.
Yes, I need to find the... So this is just to wrap up. Thank you to all our speakers today, the keynote and the papers and the panel. That was really incredible. I wish that we had another hour to go there, but I think we all learned a lot. I certainly learned a lot. And this is really pointing us in a good direction for, you know, the next challenges in podcast recommendations. So thank you all for joining us. We have a Google group. It's called PodRecs. If you'd like to continue the conversations here, we can connect there. I've also taken a note of some of the questions in the chat for the panelists, and we'll send them to them if they have time. We can try and post this on that group as well. So thanks everyone again. I hope you enjoy the rest of RecSys, and yeah, yes, hope we'll talk to you all soon.